The emergence of the Trojan War as a cataclysm in both mortal and divine memory cannot be understood without first tracing the sacred fractures among the gods, and the slow accumulation of mortal pride in the river valleys and mountain passes of Bronze Age Anatolia and Achaea. Before ships crossed the Aegean and towers fell into ash, there was a gathering on the slopes of Mount Pelion. Here, amid pine and storm song, the gods convened for a wedding not meant for mortal eyes, a union between Peleus, mortal son of Aeacus, king of Aegina, and Thetis, the silver-footed Nereid, whose womb would carry a wrath the earth was never meant to endure. It was there in that high ancestral grove that Eris, goddess of discord, cast a single object into the sacred gathering, an apple of burnished gold, inscribed with 3 words that would outlive cities to the fairest. What followed was not a quarrel, but the unraveling of divine balance. Hera, queen of Olympus and guardian of thrones, Athene, spear-eyed maiden of wisdom and war, and Aphrodite, mother of desire, each laid claim to the fruit as if it were a crown. Zeus, knowing the gravity of favor, refused to judge. Instead, he gestured toward the shadowed folds of Mount Ida, to a boy tending cattle among oaks and streams, Paris, prince of Troy in exile, son of Priam and Hecuba, whose fate had already been bound to fire in a dream of burning torches. Paris did not know that his decision would fracture the heavens. When the 3 goddesses came to him, cloaked in divine splendor, they did not speak as deities, but as empires. Hera offered dominion, the lordship of all men under sun and crown. Athene promised glory, wisdom unshakable, victory in every war. But it was Aphrodite who whispered deepest, promising him the love of the most beautiful woman alive. Her voice did not thunder, it fell like dew, and Paris, struck not by desire but by the scent of fated ruin, gave her the apple. So it was that Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and leader, queen of a proud and fragile throne, became the bride of prophecy. Though she had not yet sailed, the war had already begun. For across the Aegean, kings remembered old oaths, forged by Tyndareus in fear of Helen's beauty. They had sworn to defend her marriage, to protect the man who would win her hand, an oath that bound the sons of Atreus, the cunning of Ithaca, the rage of Thea, and the iron of Thessaly into a single braided cord of wrath. Helen's abduction, whether stolen, seduced, or surrendered, would become the hinge upon which centuries would turn. But it was the judgment of Paris, spoken among the pines, that opened the gate. The gods did not forget. Olympus fractured, the sea grew restless, and far below, in the fertile plains of the Troad, where the river Scamander carved its path past wheat and citadel stone, the city of Troy stood unknowing, crowned in walls that would soon echo with 10 years of siege and song. The apple had been thrown, the goddesses had chosen, and the wind, which had once carried prayers, now carried only silence. The origins of Helen cannot be unraveled from the tangled roots of myth and lineage, for her conception marked the fusion of celestial violence and mortal frailty. She was born not from womb alone, but from rupture, a swan-shaped god and a queen of Sparta leader whose sleep was interrupted by Zeus himself. From this unnatural union came twin eggs, and from one of them, Helen emerged beside Clytemnestra, her sister in blood, but not in fate. Even in infancy, she bore the burden of being seen not merely as beautiful, but as the mirror of desire through which men would come to know ruin. Sparta, nestled between the Taygetus Mountains and the banks of the Eurotas River, became her cradle and her forge. As she grew, her presence became an event. Priests whispered omens when she walked. Kings traveled from the corners of the Achaean world to seek her hand, and her very name began to shape politics. To prevent bloodshed among these suitors, Diomedes of Argos, Ajax of Salamis, Odysseus of Ithaca, Menelaus of Mycenaean descent, her earthly father, King Tyndareus, enacted a sacred pact that all would swear an oath to defend Helen's marriage and to avenge any man who lost her should harm ever come. In this promise, the seed of war was sown into the hearts of kings. Helen chose Menelaus, and with him came wealth and red-haired royalty, but no peace. She bore him a daughter, Hermione, and sat upon a throne of lions, but her spirit wandered. For Helen was not shaped for stillness. She was not born of fire to warm a hearth. Her spirit belonged to the storm. So when Paris, Prince of Troy, crossed the Aegean under the false blessing of diplomacy, he did not see a queen, he saw a prophecy walking. Helen received him not as an invader, but as one already written into her dream. Some say Aphrodite cast a spell. Others say Helen yearned to be undone. Whatever the truth, she left with Paris, crossing the sea like a stolen constellation. Whether abducted or complicit, history would never agree. But the wind that carried their ship to Troy carried with it the breath of 10,000 warriors sharpening their blades in grief and rage. Across Mycenae, Argos, Pylos, and beyond, the oath was called upon like a trumpet in a tomb. Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus and high king of the Achaeans, answered with ambition veiled as loyalty. Nestor of sandy Pylos brought wisdom weathered by age. Odysseus, though reluctant, brought cleverness and calculation. And then there was Achilles, still young, still burning, the son of Thetis and prophecy, whose wrath would become legend. Helen arrived in Troy not as a queen in exile, but as a fire dressed in silk. The city received her with both awe and foreboding. Priam, the old king, greeted her with trembling grace, but Cassandra, his daughter, cursed with truth that no one believed, wept in silence. Andromache turned her face. Hecuba dreamed of wolves. For 9 years Helen would walk the halls of Ilium, her presence dividing hearths, dreams, and altars. To some she was a goddess, to others a curse. In her eyes men saw their own reflection twisted by longing. Her beauty, untouched by time, became a weapon sharper than any spear. The Trojans called her Lady of the East Wind. The Greeks called her Helen of Troy, a name she never claimed. Yet beneath the silks she bore the weight of the dead. She remembered each name etched into the tide, sons of Achaea fallen beneath Troy's walls, sons of Troy shattered in defense of her presence. The war was no longer about her, it had become a ritual, a sacrifice to pride and fate, and Helen was both altar and offering. When Helen stood upon the walls and watched the armies clash beneath her feet, she saw no glory, she saw ghosts forming from dust and blood. She remembered her daughter left behind, her sisters growing old, her name becoming legend, not truth. And yet she did not leave, for where could she go? Every shore had branded her as a flame. Helen, the woman made of light and longing, had become the axis of a war that would outlive her. She would one day return to Sparta, draped again in silence, but never truly home. For she had crossed into a place no map could chart, the land between memory and myth, where blame and beauty are the same. And still the gods watched. The unity of the Achaeans did not arise from kinship, nor from diplomacy, but from a vow older than war itself, the oath of Tyndareus, sworn when Helen was yet unmarried, when kings of every distant land gathered beneath Sparta's tiled roofs. Bound by sacred fire and by Zeus as witness, they pledged to defend the marriage of Helen, whomever she chose, and to exact vengeance should that bond be broken. At the time, it seemed a solution to rivalries. In truth, it was the stitching of a noose that would one day tighten around the neck of Troy. When word reached Mycenae that Helen had vanished, the oath reawakened like a beast beneath the earth. Menelaus, stripped of wife and pride, turned to his brother Agamemnon, the king of golden Mycenae, whose walls bore lions and whose vaults overflowed with bronze. The cry for vengeance passed from palace to palace, through Corinth, Thebes, and Argos, like a wind stirring swords from scabbards. The lords of Hellas, once fractured by ambition and lineage, began to gather beneath a single banner, that of vengeance dressed as honor. From Pylos came old Nestor, his chariot wheels as weathered as his counsel. From Crete came Idomeneus, storm-blooded and restless. Ajax the Greater, a colossus of Salamis, answered with a shield as wide as a tower. His kin, Ajax the Lesser, came too quick, cruel, and clever. From Thessaly came Protelaus, and from Phthia with thunder behind him came Achilles, a youth clad in prophecy, whose armor had not yet tasted war, but whose name was already folded into songs. Odysseus, the clever snake of Ithaca, resisted at first. He had sown his fields with salt, feigned madness, and yoked oxen to mismatched plows. But Palames, suspecting trickery, placed Odysseus's infant son before the blade of his plow. When Odysseus swerved to spare him, the ruse collapsed. With fury buried behind his eyes, he took up arms, and the gods took note. The call reached Arcadia, Aetolia, Locris, and all the islands that rose like scattered bones from the Aegean. With them came not just warriors, but scribes, priests, blacksmiths, shipwrights, all drawn to Orlys where the fleet would gather. Soon the bay was filled with ships, sails coiled like sleeping wings. Over 1,000 vessels, their hulls carved with serpents and lions, lined the shores. Oars dipped in salt and helms glinted beneath the early light. But the wind would not rise. For days, then weeks, the sea remained still. The gods, it seemed, were withholding breath. The seers cast bones and burned entrails. And it was the prophet Calchas who named the price. Artemis, offended by Agamemnon, had stayed the wind. Only blood would open the sea, and so they called for Iphigenia. Agamemnon's daughter came dressed for marriage, thinking herself bride to Achilles. Instead, she found an altar slick with fear. Some say she was slain, her throat opened by a father's trembling hand. Others say Artemis took her, replacing her with a deer, and carried her away to a distant temple. Either way, when her body or its illusion fell, the wind returned. Thus did the Achaeans embark. The 1,000 ships, black-prowed and thunder-mouthed, left Orlys like a storm loosened from Olympus. Across the wine-dark sea they sailed, bound for Troy, for vengeance, for glory, for memory. The prows cut through Poseidon's realm, and dolphins danced beside them like omens. The oars beat the rhythm of wrath, and at the head of the fleet sailed Achilles, with Patroclus at his side and the Myrmidons cloaked in silence. Troy, ancient and walled, had not yet seen the sea glow with fire. Its markets still bustled, and children still played with swords with olive branches. But from the heights of Mount Ida, the gods looked down and knew peace had already died. The oath had gathered kings, the wind had gathered sails, and fate, sharpened, began to whisper through the rigging. The emergence of Troy as a citadel of myth and commerce cannot be disentangled from the convergence of Anatolian, Aegean, and Thracian currents that swirled across the late Bronze Age, ca. 1300 BCE. Rising from the stratified remains of at least 9 superimposed cities, the city called Wilusa in Hittite annals, Ilios to the Greeks, occupied a liminal zone at the mouth of the Dardanelles, where the Aegean and the Black Sea exchanged breath through the narrow strait of the Hellespont. It was here, upon the windswept mound of Hisarlik in modern-day Sanakel province, that the Trojans, children of Dardanus and Tros, constructed a city of stone that would one day gaze into the abyss of flame. The Scamander River, called Karamandias today, flowed from Mount Ida's shadow like a vein of memory, irrigating the fields that fed Troy's horses and its harvest gods. The Simwa ran beside it, its waters colder, quicker, and steeper, rushing past sycamores and limestone boulders, ancient as the breath of Poseidon. Between these rivers and atop the ridge, the Acropolis of Troy Via rose, its cyclopean walls measuring 6 meters thick and fortified with towers, bastions, and stonework laid in herringbone patterns. The fortifications, built atop the ruins of Troy VI, bore scars of tremors and conquest, their very foundations an argument against time. Archaeological excavations, begun by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, and later refined by Wilhelm Dürpfeld, Karl Blegen, and Manfred Kaufmann, peeled back the layers of this ancient scar, revealing burnt debris, sling stones, arrowheads, and crushed ceramics embedded in ash. Mycenaean pottery, stirrup jars, craters, and kylikes was found mingled with Anatolian wares, evidence of trade, diplomacy, or perhaps tribute. The burnt layer of Troy Via dating ca. 1190 BCE suggested not just destruction, but siege. Yet Troy was more than battlements and bronze. It was a node of sacred geography, rooted in the bloodlines of gods and mortals. Dardanus, its mythic ancestor, was said to have descended from Zeus himself, arriving from Arcadia or Samothrace, depending on the tongue that spoke the story. His line gave rise to Tros, and from Tros came Ilus, who founded Ilium and received from the sky the Palladium, a wooden statue of Athene said to guarantee Troy's safety so long as it remained within her walls. This statue, cloaked in divine breath, was kept within the temple at the city's heart, guarded not just by soldiers, but by silence. King Priam, in the twilight of his reign, ruled this Troy, the ninth and final of her kind. His palace, excavated in outline, stood near the citadel's summit, its walls likely adorned in painted plaster and its courtyards lined with columned porticos. From this seat, Priam governed a kingdom bound not by one people but many, Teucrians, Dardanians, Phrygians, and Luwians, all tributaries to the greater river of Troy. His sons were warriors and seers. Hector, the eldest, carried the weight of walls on his back. Paris, born Alexandros, carried prophecy like a curse. The Trojans were neither wholly Anatolian nor Achaean, but something between, a hybrid polity with linguistic, architectural, and diplomatic strands drawn from both east and west. Their chariots bore spoked wheels of Mycenaean design, but their altars burned cedar for Anatolian gods. In burial, they favored inhumation over cremation, laying their dead in stone-lined pits with bronze pins, ceramic vessels, and the occasional boar's tusk helmet. No single script survives them, but seal impressions and diplomatic letters in Hittite archives refer to their king as Alexandru of Wilusa, perhaps Paris himself. Troy's harbor lay a few kilometers to the northwest, now silted and dry, where the once navigable Bay of Besik Limani welcomed merchant ships from Cyprus, Crete, and the Levant. Tin from Anatolia, amber from the Baltic, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all passed through this node. The people of Troy walked on mosaics of the world, drank from foreign goblets, and whispered to gods whose names came from distant fires. Their temples echoed with hymns sung in many tongues, and yet for all her riches, Troy lived in tension. To the north, the Thracians loomed. To the south, the Hittites kept watch from Hattusa, and across the sea, the Achaeans grew restless beneath lion-emblazoned thrones. The balance held by diplomacy and divine relics was cracking. Earthquakes had shaken her walls in the generations before. Dreams, too, began to fracture. On the Acropolis, prophets read the entrails of sacrificed bulls and found signs not of peace, but of siege. Mothers tied red cords around the wrists of their infants. Blackbirds gathered atop the walls and did not fly away. In the palace, Hecuba dreamed of fire again. And on the battlements, Priam stood at dusk, watching the horizon with eyes older than the towers beneath him. The walls of Troy had seen traders, kings, and storms. Now they would watch the sea. The figure of Hector, eldest son of Priam and Hecuba, must be situated within the broader framework of Bronze Age warrior kings who bore not only the sword, but the soul of cities. His name, preserved in both Homeric verse and Anatolian memory, emerges from a lineage already heavy with omen. Within the eastern bastion of Troy's upper citadel, amid frescoed colonnades and bronze-wreathed hearths, Hector was raised not in reverie, but in ritual. His boyhood was shaped beneath the gaze of the god Apollo, lord of plague, prophecy, and bow, and by the rhythms of war drums echoing through the wide Scamander Valley. To understand Hector is to understand the silence of a city that knew it would burn. By the time Hector reached manhood, Troy's walls had stood for centuries. People called themselves children of Dardania, but in the language of empire and ruin, they were simply the besieged. Born into the ninth and final incarnation of the city, Hector became the inheritor of its last breath, not by ambition, but by necessity. His brothers bore different fates. Paris was the exultant seducer, Helenus the priest-seer, Deiphobus the warhound, Polydorus the golden sun. But Hector bore the burden. He was crowned in the armor of Troy long before he wore it. Unlike the Achaean heroes who fought for glory, Hector stood upon the walls of Ilium with the posture of sacrifice. His realm was not conquest, but protection, not a distant theater of plunder, but the stone alleys of his own childhood. Every gate he guarded opened to the breath of his people. Every battlement overlooked orchards, granaries, shrines to household gods. He walked those walls not as a sentinel, but as a mourner counting the living. In the barracks beyond the palace enclosure, Hector trained with veterans of the Syros campaign, men who had fought in the north against the Mysians. He learned the arc of the scythe-shaped kopis, the push of the tower shield, the lunging rhythm of the short Mycenaean thrusting spear. But more than weapons, he learned stillness, the art of measuring a man by his silence, of waiting for the dust before the charge. Archaeological remains uncovered near the lower city suggest areas dedicated to cavalry training, stone troughs, tethering posts, bridle fittings of bronze. The horse was sacred in Troy, and Hector, commander of her chariots, was seen often in the eastern stables before dawn, whispering to stallions as the mists of the Scamander River curled through the air like unspoken prayer. His breastplate was made not for flourish, but for form, layered bronze over boiled leather, decorated only by a single lion, pressed from the same mold used by his father's generation. His war cloak bore no sigils, only the deep dye of Anatolian indigo, a garment touched by no seamstress but his mother. In his left hand he carried a round shield, the leather rim thick with the grease of long polishing. In his right, a spear of ashwood from Ida, iron-tipped and darkened by blood. Hector's name, from the Greek letter 1 F15 kappa tau omega rho, derived from letter 1 F14 chi epsilon iotnu, to hold, to restrain, echoed his nature. He held the line, held his people, held his silence. He was, in form and spirit, the stone between wind and ruin, yet his dreams were not untouched by grief. The priests of Apollo, robed in white linen, had warned of a coming storm. The birds above the western tower flew in spirals that no augur would interpret. The shrine of the Earth Mother at the foot of the citadel began to crack, her effigy's eyes worn smooth by unseasonal rain. Hecuba, troubled by dreams of black ships and bleeding lions, pressed oil into her son's palms and begged him not to ride out. But still, Hector rose with the morning sun. His war council met beneath cedar beams darkened with the soot of sacred fires. There he spoke sparingly, always listening to the murmurs of Polydamas, the cautions of Aeneas, the half-mad clarity of Cassandra. He was no tyrant. He did not rage. He moved through the ranks like the moon through water, slowly, silently, and always pulling the tide behind him. Andromache, his wife, waited in the inner court, weaving prayers into fabric and teaching their son, Astyanax, the names of every gate in Troy. She feared not only Hector's death, but the death of his memory, for she knew that when the lion falls, the walls do not remember the roar, only the silence that follows. In myth, Hector is remembered for his final duel, but in truth his war began long before the spear. It began in the restraint of strength, in the denial of glory, in the way he carried his body like a temple of fate. He did not seek the gods, he obeyed them, and they in turn gave him no reward. At dusk he would climb the north tower, above the archers' posts, and look out over the plain. The Achaean ships had not yet arrived, but the horizon held a strange darkness, not of cloud, but of inevitability. He said nothing, he only watched. Below him the walls breathed, and the city waited with him. The arrival of Achilles upon the western shores of the Troad must be understood within the greater shift of the late Helladic military tide, wherein the lords of Thea, Thessaly, and beyond began to move not merely for vengeance, but to fulfill the burning arc of ancestral prophecy. By the 14th day of the fleet's disembarkation, the waters at the Bay of Troy, once calm and windless, teemed with black-hulled ships, their prows shaped like rams and lion heads, their sails furled like broken wings. Among them came the Myrmidons, kin to ants, silent in their discipline and dark in their bronze. And with them came their master, Achilles, son of Thetis, the unwept demigod of Thea, whose name had already passed through the mouths of seers and kings like the whisper of flame. Achilles was not born, he was invoked. His mother, Thetis, was a sea goddess of the old line, daughter of Nereus, the primordial elder of salt and tide. When the gods feared a prophecy that Thetis, child, would outshine his father, Zeus and Poseidon turned away, and Peleus, a mortal king of Aegina, took her hand beneath the will of Olympus. From that sacred and reluctant union came Achilles, bathed in divine fire, dipped, as later myths recall, into the river Styx, his flesh sealed in invincibility, save for the place where Thetis' fingers held him. But that story belongs to later centuries. The Bronze Age remembered Achilles not as legend, but as weapon. Raised upon Mount Pelion under the tutelage of Chiron, a centaur of iron wisdom and medicinal lore, Achilles learned to track by starlight, to fight by rhythm, and to speak the tongues of beasts and birds. He was taught the pressure points of lions and the poison roots that grew beside clean springs. Chiron taught him music, not to soothe, but to command memory, and when Achilles played, the stones themselves seemed to lean in. By age 12, he bore a spear longer than himself and trained alongside Phoenix, his foster father, who taught him the laws of kings and the ways of war. By 15, he could run faster than a stag and leap a river in full armor. His skin glistened with oil and sunlight. His hair burned red gold. His eyes bore the look of someone who already knew how he would die. Archaeological strata from Thessalian burial sites at Pharsalos and the Assyrian tombs suggest elite warrior initiations involving riverstone blades and charred animal offerings, rites perhaps echoing the early trials of Thyian nobility, and possibly that of Achilles himself. Mycenaean amphorae from the region depict a figure with a lion crest helmet and dual-plume shield, always larger than the others. Though no inscription bears his name, the image is older than Homer. When the summons came to sail for Troy, Achilles was kept hidden, dressed as a girl among the daughters of Lycomedes on the island of Scyros. Thetis had foreseen the war, and more, she had seen her son's death at its end. But destiny has long fingers. Odysseus, disguised as a merchant, laid out weapons and jewelry before the disguised Achilles. When a trumpet blast echoed from outside, only one child seized a blade. The truth was revealed. The war resumed. He arrived at Troy not as a boy, but as a tempest. His ship cut through the Aegean like prophecy itself. When he stepped ashore, the sand did not rise to meet him, it bowed. He wore no crown, only armor forged by mortal hands, gleaming with fresh polish and untested wrath. The Myrmidons followed, silent, disciplined, their shields marked with black spirals and ash-colored suns. Each bore a single scar across the right cheek, a rite of submission to their lord. Achilles did not address the kings. He stood apart, nearer to Patroclus, his companion, his twin in soul if not in name. Patroclus, older by a breath, gentler by a word, was the tether between god-born fury and mortal mercy. It was said he once killed a boy over a dice game, and ever since bore his life like penance until he found Achilles and became his shadow. The Achaeans, seasoned with age and pride, watched Achilles with a mix of awe and foreboding. Ajax the Greater muttered a quiet prayer. Agamemnon narrowed his gaze, already sensing that no high king could fully command the flame he had welcomed. Nestor, old and wise, marked the way the wind moved around the boy, not through him, but around. And yet Achilles did not boast. He trained. He ran the length of the beach until his feet bled. He polished his own spear. He played the lyre at night, seated alone near the fire, eyes fixed on nothing. When asked why he came, he only said, "Because I must." In the way he moved, the gods were already present, but the war had not yet begun. The Trojans had not yet seen him. Hector, in the towers, sensed something new in the distant dust. Cassandra refused to look west. And Helen, standing alone in the upper chamber of Priam's palace, felt a sudden warmth along her spine, as if a star had risen too close to the earth. Achilles had come, and though the sky was blue, the plain began to darken. The third phase of the Trojan conflict, spanning approximately 9 years from the Achaean landing to the final breach of the city's outer defenses, represents not a single theater of war, but a prolonged collapse of order across the western Anatolian seaboard. The plain of Ilium, hemmed by the rivers Simwa and Scamander and watched by the stone-eyed towers of Troy, became less a battlefield than a sacrificial ground, not for honor but for attrition. Beneath a sun that never ceased, the gods withdrew into their altars, and men were left to die beneath a sky that offered no omen, only heat. The war, as recorded in the Iliad's shadows and corroborated by the archaeological remains of Troy Vere, did not erupt in fury, but in erosion. The Achaeans, unable to penetrate Troy's Cyclopean gates, turned their wrath upon her tributaries. Across the Troad and beyond, Lionessus, Thebe, Pedasus, and Hypoplacian Thebes, the Greek spear darkened the fields. These were not battles in formation, but sudden incursions, cattle seized, grain burned, wells poisoned, cities razed not for glory, but for denial. Every tree felled was a breath stolen from Troy's lungs. In the ruins of Lionessus, modern excavations at the Kusuk Kushla site have uncovered layers of burned scar atop defensive mud brick, along with smashed Mycenaean-style pottery and bronze arrowheads of Achaean design, long, barbed, and bitter. From this shattered shell came Briseis, torn from heart to be offered as a prize to Achilles, a name in the shadow of conquest. Likewise, Chryseis was taken from the temple of Apollo Smintheus, near present-day Gulpenar, where her father's supplication would later call down pestilence upon the invaders. Throughout this long summer of war, the Achaeans lived not as an army, but as an encamped wound. Their tents sprawled from the edge of the shoreline to the base of the hills, their ships drawn up on the beach like beached whales. Fires smoked in uneven rhythms. The smell of bronze and sweat clung to the reeds. Every morning, names were scratched into bark and shieldback, a ritual of remembrance in case that day swallowed them. Achilles hunted inland. Ajax built traps of stone and earth for wild boar. Odysseus mapped the rivers, searching for alternate routes to the city walls. Agamemnon sat in a golden tent, his authority slowly tarnishing in the heat, his men growing restless. They fought among themselves as often as against Troy. Duels broke out over loot, over women, over honor. The gods, too, began to waver. Athene, once the war's architect, turned her gaze towards strategy rather than slaughter. Apollo withdrew into silence. Hera urged Agamemnon onward, while Artemis, wounded by the defilement of her sacred groves, stirred storms from the western sea. The divine chorus that had once sung the war into being now fractured, leaving mortals to bleed beneath their absence. But Troy did not fall. Within her walls, life bent but did not break. Fields were tilled under guard. Temples were swept daily. The market still opened at first light. Funeral rites multiplied, but they remained whole: the washing of the dead, the oiling of limbs, the placement of the coin, the carved name upon the funerary stele. Even as the plain turned to ash, Troy held to ritual. Children were born. Songs were sung. Offerings left in the temple of the storm god near the east gate bore inscriptions in Luwian script, asking not for victory, but for endurance. Still the Achaeans came. Raids reached as far inland as Mount Ida. Andromache's brother perished near Plakos. Cassandra dreamed of serpents in the grain. Hector rode out only to scatter the enemy, never to pursue. The war to him was not a contest of champions, it was the long defense of breath. Time did not pass, it circled. Seasons returned not as markers, but as repetitions. Each summer the heat deepened. Each winter the sea offered no passage. Each spring the corpses thawed. And in the camp, beneath the broken banners of 1,000 kings, Achilles sat silent. He did not fight in these years. His wrath slept. He polished his armor. He whispered to Patroclus. His blade remained sheathed, like a storm refusing to fall. The Greeks grew weary of their own noise. 9 years of dust, 9 years of silence, and still Troy stood. The rupture between Achilles and Agamemnon, often framed in epic verse as a quarrel of pride, must instead be understood as a catastrophic breach in the spiritual cohesion of the Achaean alliance. a rift not only of kingship, but of cosmic law. The event unfolded not at the height of battle, but in the still heat of camp, where leadership faltered and the gods looked away. The catalyst was Briseis, a woman taken from the sack of Lionessus, a city burned and buried beneath the eastern ridges of the Troad, its bones still visible in the charred outlines of collapsed stone dwellings unearthed along the Kusuk-Kushla corridor. Briseis, daughter of Briseus, priest or prince, was no mere captive. She was a thread from the altar to the battlefield, woven into the sacred equilibrium Achilles guarded with more than steel. In seizing her from the tent of Achilles, Agamemnon did not simply assert dominion. He broke the silent covenant of honor that governed Mycenaean command, the unspoken law among bronze-clad kings who led through glory, not decree. Briseis was not just a prize, but the embodiment of Achilles, earned stature among the Achaeans. Her removal was not the act of a sovereign. It was an unmaking, a public undoing of the only man whom the gods had anointed with flame. The wrath that followed was not noise but absence. Achilles withdrew. He did not argue nor shout nor lift his blade. He sat, he watched the surf, he closed his tent flap. The Myrmidons, once a thundercloud behind the Greek line, ceased all motion. Their fires dimmed, their shields gathered dust. The music of Thea vanished from the shore, replaced by the low murmur of confusion and fracture. And across the lines, the heartbeat of the Achaean campaign stuttered. To the Greeks, this silence was worse than retreat. For Achilles was more than a warrior, he was the symbol of divine favor. His hands had been guided by Thetis, his feet swifter than the wind, his name spoken by priests in temples from Pylos to Thebes. Without him, the war lost its axis. Morale waned. Victory, once a matter of time, now seemed veiled in ash. Agamemnon, though king of men, found himself surrounded by muttering councils. Nestor advised reconciliation. Odysseus offered subtle diplomacy. Even Diomedes, eager for battle, urged caution. But Agamemnon, bound by wounded pride, dug deeper into command. He offered compensation, gifts, and wealth, but Achilles wanted none. It was not gold that had been taken, it was the place of his name beneath heaven. Briseis herself, confined now in the king's pavilion, became a figure suspended between war and worship. She was a woman of Anatolian grace, perhaps Luwian or Cilician in blood, her language a soft curve of consonants. She had served in the shrine of Artemis or Aphrodite, scholars dispute, and was trained in rites older than the siege that now held her captive. Though Homeric texts speak little of her thoughts, the silence she carries echoes in the archaeological gap between looted sanctuaries and vanished priestesses. She is the thread that connects empire to emotion, altar to anger. In Achilles' absence, the Greeks bled. Trojans surged from the gates emboldened. Hector rode farther and faster. Sarpedon of Lycia brought his winged legions to the fray. The tide shifted. The Achaean dead, once buried in high mounds with carved stele and bronze weapons beside them, now rotted in the heat, unburied. Burial mounds along the Sigean ridge show hurried interments, shallow grave, bent swords, signs of panic and disarray. Apollo, god of plague and vengeance, stalked the Achaean camp. His arrows were unseen, but their mark was clear: fever, stillbirth, death without wound. The priests of the Achaeans offered sacrifices, but the smoke drifted back upon them. Calchas, the seer, wept openly, declaring that the gods no longer listened. The thunder was gone, and still Achilles did not return. Instead, he summoned Thetis from the deep. She rose from the sea as mist, and Achilles knelt before her like a child, like a king undone. He did not ask for Briseis. He asked for justice. He asked that the Greeks suffer in his absence, that they be taught the cost of dishonor. Thetis listened, and then with a voice made of salt and sorrow, she ascended Olympus to plead with Zeus. The gods, who had once danced at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, now listened not with celebration, but with gravity. Zeus, cloud-gatherer, nodded once. Hera turned her face. Fate shifted, and the war, long dulled by years of attrition, prepared again to blaze. Achilles remained by the sea. The waves, once companions to his silence, now whispered back with mourning. He did not speak, he did not move, but in his stillness, the world began to turn. The sacred topography of Troy's final decade cannot be charted solely by burnt fortifications or broken blades. It must be traced within the invisible strata of dreams, where history's final breath rises not from the sword, but from the mouth of a prophet. Within the Acropolis of Troy Via, amid porticos cracked by salt winds and chambers carved in cedar and blood, the soul of the city began to unweave itself. Though the Achaeans had not yet breached the walls, something older had already entered, a shadow deeper than siege, the scent of foreseen collapse. Cassandra, daughter of Priam and Hecuba, stood at the threshold of vision. She had been touched by Apollo, granted the voice of foresight, then cursed by the god she would not love, her words turned to dust in the ears of men. The curse was not that she could see, the curse was that none would follow her gaze. Each night, within the temple precincts near the Pergamo's gate, she whispered to the stone idols of Dardanus and Ilus, her hands bloodied from clawing the shrine's lintel. She saw fire licking the roofs. She saw the tower fall. She saw her brothers broken and her body dragged. The priests would not listen. The kings averted their eyes. The wind carried her warnings away like smoke. Troy had become a city that no longer believed in its own future. The seers of lesser houses saw it too, dreams of lions entering the stables, dreams of the sea rising to cover the fields. Ritual vessels from the lower district, uncovered centuries later, show images of gates bursting and women wailing, inscribed beside older Hittite storm gods whose altars had long since quieted. A steel fragment, found near the sanctuary of the mother goddess Cubaba, depicts a woman with snakes for hair sheltering a child beneath a falling wall. Whether this is Cassandra or Hecuba is unknown, but the image is carved in sorrow. Helen moved through these dreams like a living spectre. Her presence, once blinding, now cast a softer shadow, mournful in its beauty. She walked the parapets in silence, no longer adorned, her garments plain, her hair bound not in gold but in dark linen. The Trojans still revered her, but in reverence born of fear, not for what she was, but for what her presence portended. Children who passed her in the halls did not meet her gaze. Mothers whispered prayers when she entered the market. Helen, once the reason for war, had become its witness. In the inner courtyard of Priam's palace, the Megaron complex that overlooked the river's curve, she met Andromache each morning. They did not speak of the Greeks. They spoke of children, of bread, of dreams. Helen asked how to braid a child's hair. Andromache asked how the ships smelled when the Achaeans landed. These were the sacred conversations of women who already knew how the war would end. They did not ask if, they asked when. And within this chamber of quiet knowing, Hector stood. He held Astyanax, his son, named for the city he would never rule. The child laughed, reaching for the horsehair crest of his father's helm. And Hector, lion of Troy, breaker of Achaean ranks, trembled. His arms, muscled from years of shield and spear, shook not with fear, but with the sorrow of prophecy fulfilled. He had seen the burnt gates in his sleep. He had seen Andromache's veil stained red. He had seen his son thrown from the battlements by Mycenaean hands. He did not speak of it. He kissed the child's forehead and whispered a blessing. Below the palace, in the lower city, the people began to bury their gods, not with ritual but with forgetting. The altars still burned, but the hymns grew fainter. Offerings were made in haste. The temple of Apollo Thymbrius stood open to the wind. Priests once robed in saffron now wore simple wool. Sacrificial bulls trembled beneath the blade. Even the horses, long sacred to the Dardanian bloodline, refused to eat, their manes unkempt, their eyes wide with something older than instinct. Omens gathered. A statue of Athene cracked at the base. A falcon dropped dead on the palace steps. A child was born with 6 fingers and another without a cry. Hecuba dreamed of a tower of flame and woke with blood on her hands. And still, the Trojans held the walls. Outside, the Greeks feuded and bled. Inside, Troy dreamed itself into the grave. The city had become a vessel of endings, not of stone, but of memory, and no one could wake. The division of the Olympian pantheon during the late phase of the Trojan War marks not merely a theological rupture, but a mythohistorical fracture in the cosmological fabric through which Bronze Age peoples understood fate, justice, and the sacred contract between heaven and earth. The deities of Olympus, once seated in equilibrium atop the snow-veiled peaks of Thessalian myth, became fractured along lines of desire, no longer impartial, but partisan. The war waged on the plains of Ilium found its mirror not in the politics of men, but in the rivalries of the divine. Zeus, skyfather and keeper of oaths, sat upon his golden throne with thunder coiled behind his brow. His silence, misread as indifference, was in truth a yielding to inevitability, a silent nod to destiny's slow unfolding. He did not command the war. He watched it rise like steam from the cracks of human fault. For even he, in the shadow of the Moirai, the Fates, could not untwist the thread once it was drawn. Beneath his gaze, Hera moved in wrath. Queen of Olympus, protector of marriage and throne, Hera had long despised the Trojans for Paris' judgment upon Mount Ida. She had offered him dominion, he chose desire. And so, she turned her vengeance not only toward him, but toward the city that bore his name. She became the war's architect in the halls of kings, its whisper in the ear of Agamemnon, its fire behind the sails of the Achaean fleet. Athene, daughter of Zeus and Metis, bore her grievance not with flame but with iron logic. She too had been scorned in the contest of the golden apple, and her mind, vast as rivers in flood, turned cold. She favored Odysseus, favored Diomedes, favored war as a means of measured order. Her hand guided spears with surgical grace. Her shield, the aegis, bore not compassion, but the Gorgon face of warning. In her temple at Athens, sacred fires were stoked each day the war continued, and the city bore her anger as a mantle. Aphrodite, the third in the triad of that fateful judgment, stood alone in radiant contradiction. She had won the apple, but in doing so, had bound herself to a war whose outcome would smother beauty. Her protection of Paris was not love, it was obligation. Her shield was woven of illusions. She could defend with seduction, with mist, with the turning of eyes. She favored Troy not because it deserved to endure, but because it had once been promised a prize. These three goddesses, all born of the old order, Hera from Rhea, Athene from the skull of prophecy, Aphrodite from the foam and blood of Uranus, became avatars of wrath, wisdom, and desire. And through them, the Achaeans moved like puppets dressed in bronze. Apollo stood apart. He too had taken a side, though not out of vengeance, but of grief. He loved the Trojans. He had walked their temples in the form of a mortal. He had blessed their sons, healed their sick, and sung in the inner courts of Priam's palace. When Agamemnon desecrated his shrine and seized Chryses, Apollo answered not with words, but with plague. His arrows, silent and silver, fell upon the Greek camp with the weight of judgment. The bodies they struck did not blade, they burned from within. Artemis, his sister of moonlight and deer, remained ambiguous. She did not favor Troy nor Greece. She favored the balance that both had broken. Her forests burned beneath the raiders' torches. Her sacred groves were trampled by hoof and chariot. She withdrew into silence, and her absence was a curse of its own. Ares, god of war, bore no allegiance but to chaos. Though said to have favored the Trojans, his loyalty shifted with the blood. He fought where the noise was loudest. His footprints were found wherever bones outnumbered the living. He was not summoned, he appeared. And Poseidon, Earthshaker, Sea Lord, favored the Greeks, not from affection, but from old enmity. He had once built the walls of Troy with Apollo, cheated of payment by Laomedon, Priam's father. He remembered. His trident stirred storms in the Aegean, and the waves obeyed him when the Greeks set sail. The heavens mirrored the battlefield. From the vaults of the sky to the trembling of the sea, every god had chosen, every altar was weighed, and every prayer became a piece in a greater stratagem. Offerings burned at the feet of idols with hollow eyes. Smoke curled upward, carrying promises and desperation alike. Bronze blades were kissed with blood and placed beside carved images in hope of favor. The gods, once symbols of order, now wore human skin in ambition and pride. At night, when the fires flickered low along the Greek encampment and the towers of Troy blinked in the dark like distant stars, the veil between the worlds thinned. Soldiers dreamed of gods walking among them. Some awoke with wounds they had not received in battle. Others saw Hera's eyes in the flames or felt Athene's breath behind their shield arm. Priests read the entrails of lambs and saw only spirals. The gods had entered the war not as overseers, but as partisans. They tipped spears. They turned the wind. They poisoned dreams. And somewhere beneath all this, the fates continued spinning, their thread pulled tighter, their blades kept sharp. The gods, though mighty, were not above the story. They were caught inside it. The intervention of Patroclus into the tide of battle on the plain of Ilium, cloaked in the armor of another, represents one of the most sacred transgressions in the ritualized warfare of the late Bronze Age. No earlier Mycenaean precedent bears witness to this act, wherein the spirit of one man was clothed in the divine shell of another, not for glory but for grief. Patroclus, son of Menoetius of Opus, companion to Achilles since boyhood, crossed the threshold not to find fame, but to postpone annihilation. He was not born for war, but he walked into it anyway, radiant with the borrowed wrath of a godkin who would not rise. Raised in Phthia under the shadow of exile, for he had once struck down a noble child in a moment of youthful rage, Patroclus came to Achilles not as a rival, but as refuge. The two were fostered together in the house of Peleus, drank from the same vessel, hunted the same hills, wept at the same songs. Chiron, the same centaur who taught Achilles the ways of medicine, music, and martial craft, taught Patroclus too, but with gentler touch. His name in the old tongue meant glory of the father, yet he bore himself not with the burden of honor, but with the weight of mercy. When the Achaean line broke beneath Hector's onslaught, when Sarpedon fell and the Trojans surged toward the Greek ships like fire down a hillside, it was Patroclus who entered Achilles' tent, not to plead, not to condemn, but to ask, "Lend me your armor." Achilles, still bound in silence, unstrapped the bronze that Hephaestus had forged with starfire and fate. Breastplate, greaves, helmet, all passed into the hands of one who wore them not as his own, but as a shroud. The Myrmidons, stunned to see their master stand once more, not in body but in form, followed. A false resurrection marched behind them, hope rekindled under false stars. Patroclus entered the battlefield like a second dawn. His spear cast shadows across the Trojan vanguard. His chariot wheels ground into the dust symbols of reversal. The Trojans fell back, believing Achilles had returned, and for a time, brief, eternal, he did. But this fire was not immortal. It was tender, borrowed. The armor did not grant invincibility to the man beneath it. It only carried the illusion. He cut down warriors of name and none, Pyrrhechiums of Paeonia, Areilycus, Eurymas, Amphotrus. He reached the body of Sarpedon, son of Zeus, and spilled it upon the dust. The gods cried out. Zeus wept. Blood rained in the form of petals. The Myrmidons cheered, not knowing that every strike brought the thread closer to its snapping point. In archaeology, the grave of fallen champions are sometimes marked by a strange duality, a lavish burial alongside symbols of transience, broken swords, unlit oil lamps, ash scattered across gold. Perhaps the tomb of Patroclus, if it ever stood, bore such contradiction. His was a glory not rooted in conquest, but in sacrifice made in another man's name. It was Hector who met him at the height of his fire. The prince of Troy, weary with the knowledge of his own end, saw the figure before him and knew this was not Achilles. The stride was different. The hands are less sure. But the fury was real, and it demanded an answer. The duel was not long. Apollo struck first from behind, unseen, his hand not of vengeance, but of restoration, rebalancing the war's unnatural turn. Euphorbus followed, wounding Patroclus beneath the shoulder. Then Hector drove the final blow, a spear beneath the ribs. The armor, still gleaming, fell away. The man beneath, soft-voiced, gentle-eyed, collapsed, and the dust received him. As he died, he spoke. He warned Hector of his own death. He did not curse, he did not rage, he only said, "Achilles will come," and in that moment the entire plain held its breath. In the camp of the Achaeans, word reached Achilles. It was not a messenger who told him, it was the silence. The sea ceased its rhythm. The horses refused food. The myrmidons wept without knowing why. Achilles fell upon the ground, tore his hair, blackened his face with ash. His cry was not that of a man. It was the cry of fate itself awakening. He did not eat, he did not drink, he lay beside the body. He swore vengeance not only upon Hector, but upon life, upon the gods, upon the thread that had dared cut his second soul. He would return to battle, not for glory, not even for Patroclus, but because the world had ruptured and only fire could suture it. The armor was lost. The friend was gone. The gods had watched. And now the war would truly begin. The re-entry of Achilles into the theater of war following the death of Patroclus signifies a spiritual and strategic rupture that transcends the boundaries of mortal vengeance and enters the realm of divine terror. In the annals of Bronze Age warfare, no moment bears such concentrated fury, not from city-sacking kings nor siegecraft, but from one man-made instrument, his body clothed in mythology, his soul stripped bare. His return was not a decision. It was a consequence. When Thetis rose from the sea, summoned by the agony of her son, she did not bring comfort. She brought the promise of a weapon. In the forge of Hephaestus, where the molten core of the world is poured into shape and fate is bent to form, a new armor was made, not as the old one was, but greater, edged in fire, rimmed in prophecy. The cuirass gleamed like still water under blood moon. The greaves shone like dawn in iron. The shield, vast, round, celestial, was etched with all the things Achilles had lost. Cities in peace, cities in ruin, a wedding, a war, a child, a grave, the dance of the harvest, the silence of death. It was the whole of human life, captured in bronze, pressed against the chest of a man who had lost all reason to live. When he put it on, the sea recoiled. The Myrmidons, silent since Patroclus' death, rose again, not in hope, but in fear. Their lord had returned, but he no longer belonged to them. He no longer belonged to Greece. He belonged to wrath. He stood before the assembly of kings, Agamemnon, Odysseus, Diomedes, and did not wait for an apology. He did not request the return of Briseis, though she was brought with trembling hands. He only asked for battle. His eyes were unmade. His speech was not command, it was a sentence. The men of Achaea, seeing him, remembered that he had never been fully theirs. At dawn the sky cracked. Achilles did not ride, he strode. His chariot followed behind him, drawn by immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius, gifted by Poseidon. When he mounted, Xanthus turned its head and spoke in the tongue of men, "You shall die soon." The horse was struck mute thereafter. Even the beasts could see the thread thinning. The battle that followed cannot be measured in tactics or terrain. It was not a campaign, it was a cleansing. Achilles moved through the Trojan lines like judgment. He struck Sickness, son of Poseidon, whose skin no blade could pierce. Achilles suffocated him with his own broken helmet. He met Asteropaeus, son of the river god Axios, who bore twin spears and divine ancestry. Achilles slew him and cast his body into the stream. The river choked on corpses. The Scamander, called Xanthus by the gods, rose in rebellion. Here myth and earth entwine. For the river, sacred and conscious, spoke. It begged Achilles to stop. He would not. It reared against him, flooding the plain. He fought the water itself. Boulders tumbled, trees were torn. The sky dimmed. Only with the intervention of Hephaestus, flame against flood, did the river recede. The war of gods echoed again upon the land. In Troy, the gates closed tighter. Priam climbed the walls and saw not a man, but a storm with legs. Cassandra wept without language. Hecuba folded black cloth for her altar. Hector prepared his death. But first, Achilles hunted. He sought Hector, but met many. He struck Ephesian, Demolian, Hippodamas, Dryops, and Polydorus, Priam's youngest, fleet of foot, whom Achilles pierced through as he fled. Each death was a bell. Each cry is a stone. He was not killing soldiers. He was dismantling lineage. The battlefield was a harvest of the dead. In later burials from the Troad, bones were found heaped and mixed, hastily burned, scattered, reburied. Mass grave without markers. bronze fragments fused to bone. These were not honored dead. These were the price of a demigod's sorrow. When at last Hector appeared, shining, solemn, doomed, the earth paused. But that is the next chapter. This chapter ends with blood in the river, ash on the wind, and a sky too quiet for the gods to answer. The death duel between Achilles and Hector, fought beneath the limestone ramparts of Troy's western gate, does not belong solely to the realm of martial tradition, but stands instead as a sacred rupture in the narrative thread that bound Bronze Age ethics, cosmology, and kinship into a single braided code. This was not a battle. This was judgment, the reckoning of two oaths, one to vengeance, one to duty. The son of Thetis and the son of Priam met not as mere warriors, but as the final voices of two dying worlds. The day was dry. No birds moved in the sky. The Scamander ran low, still choked with corpses. Priam stood atop the Dardanian gate, and beside him Helen held her breath. The walls that had seen 1,000 skirmishes now bore silent witness to the war's true beginning. Hector, Prince of Troy, stood alone. His armor, once golden, now bore the dull ash of 9 years of siege. His shield, rimmed in horsehair, hung heavy. His limbs remembered the weight of command, the cries of his son, the weeping of his wife. He was not afraid, but he was already mourning. He knew this would be his last stand. The gods had stopped answering his prayers. Even Apollo had withdrawn, and yet he remained. Achilles approached like a thunderhead rising across the plain. His new armor, forged by Hephaestus, caught the sunlight with such ferocity that men turned their faces away. His spear, heavier, longer, balanced with a counterweight of blood iron, did not shake. His eyes were no longer human. Grief had eclipsed them. His steps left dry footprints where grass once grew. They circled in silence. No heralds called terms. No priests drew boundaries in the dust. There were no treaties left, no sacred fires still burning in the name of guest right or kinship. The duel was not for honor, it was for release. Hector struck first, as was his way. His spear whistled, a wind-borne blade, and struck the center of Achilles' shield. It glanced, rang, and fell. The impact cracked stone beneath their feet. He drew his second spear, cast it again. It shattered against the breastplate. Hector, realizing the armor was not the old suit Patroclus had worn, but something forged beyond mortal reach, stepped back. Achilles advanced. His own spear did not fly. It pierced. He feinted left, turned, and drove the blade through Hector's collarbone, under the rim of the helmet, behind the joint where armor meets pulse. Bronze split flesh. Hector fell. There was no cry. There was only a whisper, one last breath offered not to Achilles but to Troy, to Andromache, to Astyanax, to memory. The earth went still. Even the guards upon the walls forgot to breathe. Achilles stood over the body and wept, not for Hector but for himself, for Patroclus, for the unraveling of fate. Then, without looking to the walls, he lashed Hector's feet with rawhide cord, tied the knots beneath his chariot, and dragged the Prince of Troy across the plain where he had once ruled. The dust did not rise. The ground swallowed it. Day after day, Achilles circled the tomb of Patroclus with Hector's body trailing behind, until the sinews split and the bones showed white. The Myrmidons begged him to stop. Even the Achaeans looked away. But Achilles, forged of fire, drowned in sorrow, heard only silence. Then came the gods. Apollo, mourning his once-favored prince, shrouded Hector's body from decay with divine cloth. Aphrodite wept. Hera turned her gaze. And finally, Zeus intervened. He sent a dream to Thetis, who came to her son like a tide against stone and whispered, "Release him." Far away, Priam prepared for the unthinkable. He wrapped gold and myrrh, placed it into the hands of a wagon driver, and walked into the night. Not as king, as a father, but that belongs to the next telling. This one ends with a wheel spinning in dust, a body that once held Troy's hope trailing behind it, and a man with no future left to lose. The plain of Troy, littered with the dead and darkened by ash, had never seen a silence like the one that accompanied the steps of Priam, son of Laomedon, king of the last city of the Troad. He walked not as ruler, but as mourner, bearing neither sword nor scepter, but the weight of a father's grief. Across the blood-soaked battlefield, between the trenches of Achaean spears and shattered bronze, he passed unseen, cloaked in the will of the gods, guided by Hermes who walks unseen through dreams and war alike. No other king had crossed so much time in so few steps. Priam bore in his arms a ransom older than gold, linen bound with cedar oil, woven robes dyed with the crushed breath of snails, twin amphorae filled with the tears of women, and a prayer that had not been heard since Ilium first raised the city's walls. But it was not treasure that he brought to Achilles. It was a memory. It was the echo of a father's voice, daring to speak to wrath incarnate. When he reached the tent of Peleus' son, the sea-born warrior who had defied both fate and Olympus, the old man bowed. The tent flaps, stitched with hides of slain kings, parted. Inside, the air was dense with salt and sorrow. Achilles sat alone, armor glinting red by firelight, hands still stained with the blood of Hector, his heart a storm of longing and loss. He did not rise. Priam did not tremble. He knelt, and then he kissed the hand that had ended his son. There, under the flickering light of an oil lamp fed by pressed olives and ash, the king of Troy whispered the words that only another father could hear. "Remember your own." The sentence, heavy with silence, fell upon Achilles like a tombstone laid atop an open grave. He looked at Priam and did not see a rival king. He saw Peleus. He saw the age his own father would wear if he too lost his only son. The earth shifted. The gods stilled their breath. Achilles wept. The fire burned lower. Outside, the Myrmidons turned their eyes to the wind. Inside, the son of Thetis, born of brine and vengeance, poured wine for his enemy. They sat as two old men, divided not by politics nor oaths, but by a single death. The tent held no war, only the unbearable weight of love for what had been lost. They shared bread. The barley was bitter. They poured libations into the sand. The wine hissed as if the ground itself remembered Hector's final cry. Later, when the cup was emptied and the grief was too wide to cross, Achilles stood. He gave the body back. Hector, shield-bearer of Troy, was washed with warm water and anointed with balm. Achilles himself shrouded the corpse in linen, tying the knots with hands that had killed and now sought absolution. He ordered 12 days of peace, not by counsel, not by vote, but by decree from the heart of mourning itself. At dawn, Priam departed with the body of his son lashed not to a chariot, but laid with dignity across the bed of an ox cart. Behind him, the gates of Troy waited like a mouth unwilling to reopen. In front, the sea fog rose, thick and unfeeling. The ransom had been paid, but the debt remained. In the ancient grave mounds surrounding the Scamander, where Mycenaean and Anatolian pottery alike sleep beneath dust, archaeologists in the age of iron and wire have unearthed fragments of this moment, not in clay, but in the hush between burial strata. Grave pits carved with extra care, a broken arrow buried beside olive pits, a stone weight, once used to grind wheat, inscribed with the spiral of mourning rites. These are the echoes of that night. They speak not of politics or tactics. They speak of a father who crossed a battlefield to bring his child home. Among the later Hittite records, long after Troy's walls had fallen and the flame of Ilium was reduced to myth, there are references to a diplomatic emissary, aged, unarmed, sent into the heart of war with gifts of linen and cedar. It is written not as history, but as omen. A story of grief so pure that it halted the machinery of slaughter. Priam returned to Troy, but he returned smaller, older, carved out. The city welcomed him not with trumpet or torch, but with silence. The sky held no clouds. The sea made no sound. Even the birds that once nested in the crevices of Troy's walls did not sing. Only Andromache's cry shattered the stillness. And in the darkness, a father sat beside the body of his son, still warm from the weeping of his enemy. The scorched plain between the Hellespont and the walls of Troy bore now the weight of too many deaths, too many names swallowed by the wind. The Scamander ran slow with silt and sorrow. Spears no longer sang in flight, and chariots groaned in stillness. But the silence was not peace, it was the inhalation of fate. For though Patroclus had been wept into song and Hector returned to stone-wrapped sleep, the gods had not turned their faces. The dead were not yet finished. Patroclus was buried near the ships, where the Myrmidons beat their shields in mourning. His pyre was lit with cypress wood and olive branches soaked in oil, and as the fire climbed skyward, so did the souls of those who followed him into battle. Bronze fragments, burnt ivory combs, the ash of torn linen, all mingled in a funeral mound that still rests beneath the dunes of the Troad. Archaeologists at Cape Sigean have uncovered pottery in concentric layers, each burnished by the salt wind, each inscribed with spirals and spirals and spirals, as if time itself was curling into grief. And Hector, breaker of horses, was returned to the city that had borne him in prophecy and would bury him in ruin. 12 days of lamentation hung over Troy, 12 days without the trumpet of spears or the whetting of blades. In the house of Dardanus, women cut their hair and flung it into the dust. Priam placed a veil over Andromache's mouth, not as command, but to hold her breath from breaking apart. A burial mound was raised by the Scaean gate, where wheat still refuses to grow. The stones used to circle the grave were not quarried, they were taken from Troy's own foundation, as if even the city had begun to die with him. The Iliadic silence held, but beneath it something moved. The oaths made at Aulis had not been fulfilled. The ship still waited. Agamemnon's dreams were unsettled. Odysseus counted the moons with unease. Menelaus drank with clenched fists. And high upon the Acropolis, a Trojan boy watched the sea, his small hands clinging to broken marble lions whose names had been worn away by wind. The war had not ended. It had simply shifted into shadow. In the camps of the Achaeans, funeral rites continued. Dogs were sacrificed beside oxen, not for hunger, but for omens. Clay masks were pressed against the faces of fallen comrades. A spear broken and bound with sinew was buried upright, a marker not of territory but of vengeance. Among the buried relics at the site of Basic Teep, ceramic shards from this time bear twin motifs, the flame and the eye, fire for the pyres, eyes for the gods who watched but did not weep. The divine, too, had grown still. The quarrel among immortals echoed only faintly across Mount Ida. Apollo withdrew his golden bow. Athene turned her gaze elsewhere. Even Ares, blood-hungered and breathless, stood on the threshold between revel and retreat. Only Zeus remained unmoved, counting the threads of fate from his storm-veiled throne. But below Olympus, within the minds of men, the war was writing itself again. The horse had not yet been carved, but the idea of it was breathing. In the tent of the man who had lost all honor and all patience, Odysseus shaped thought into wood. He saw that no wall was taller than hunger, and no city more sacred than the illusion of safety. He watched the Trojans bury their prince and understood that grief made cities careless. The gates had not yet opened, but the dust beneath them stirred with possibility. In the myths passed down through the Aeolian coastlines, where winds still carry the scent of that final fire, there is a tale that speaks not of war or heroism, but of waiting. Of a quiet that stretched across 13 nights when even the wolves would not howl. It is said that during that time, the spirits of the unburied whispered through the spear shafts and arrow fletchings, asking not for justice, but for completion. The dead, after all, had been promised. They had been promised when Helen crossed the narrow sea, promised when Iphigenia was led to the altar, promised when Achilles returned to the field, dragging the legacy of vengeance behind him. The earth had been fed blood, and now it opened its mouth again. The men still alive in the Achaean camp felt it. They oiled their blades not for battle but for sacrifice. They sang low songs as they kindled their fires, not for warmth, but to keep the silence from entering their lungs. They knew something was coming, not a storm but an ending. Even Troy felt it. The walls, once etched with the breath of Poseidon's hammer, creaked in the night. Doors refused to stay shut. Dreams wandered past their limits. And the boy watching the sea dreamed of fire inside a hollow thing. Burial rites gave way to prophecies. Ashes gave way to echoes, and the gods, from their high perches, leaned slightly forward, not to speak, but to listen, because something was beginning again. And in that breath between death and dawn, war waited, coiled and quiet, beneath the hooves of an unfinished horse. The strategy that would sunder Ilium's walls was not forged by bronze nor tempered by blood, but shaped in silence by the mind of a man who had learned to listen to the hesitations between heartbeats. Odysseus of Ithaca, Odysseus Polytropos, whose name would echo through shattered temples and wind-stripped thrones, conceived what sword and siege had failed to achieve. In the 13th year of the war, when even the stones had grown weary of recording names, he turned from violence and spoke instead in riddles of ash and timber. The Achaean camp by the Hellespont had become a graveyard of ambitions. Ships rotted at anchor, their ropes stiff with salt. Bronze rusted in silence. Men grew hollow-eyed. Even the pyres burned low. But within the tent of Odysseus, no larger than a hunter's lodge, an idea was kindled, a vessel not for war, but for absence. A shape not of strength, but of surrender. The tradition of sacred gifts to appease the gods had long roots in the Hellenic world. From Thessaly to Mycenae, it was known that a proper offering could reverse the will of fate. Odysseus, inheritor of such rites, twisted them into stratagem. He remembered the white bulls left to Poseidon before sea voyages. He remembered the votive shields buried beneath the thresholds of citadels. And so he spoke of a horse, not to ride, but to pray. Not living but lifelike, a beast of silence. The form would mimic the divine horses of Mount Ida, said to have borne the dreams of kings in ancient rites. It would be made from the pine of Mount Pelion, the same wood used to build the Argo, Jason's ship of quest. Its belly would be hollow, its ribs wide enough to carry warriors, its head bowed in supplication. A sacred image cloaked in reverence, yet pulsing with treachery. Epeius, the builder, was chosen to shape the vision. No mere artisan, he had carved the wooden gods that stood in the temples of Aulis. His hands knew both piety and deception. At the edge of the camp, under a veil of sea mist and moonlight, he began. Axes whispered against the trunks. Pegs were hammered with gloved hands. No fires were lit. And each plank was chosen with augury, watched by Calchas, the seer who once named the winds. To the Greeks, this was not a machine. It was a rite, and rites require disappearance. When the horse was finished, the Achaeans burned their tents, tore down their altars, and loaded the remaining ships with silence. To the watching eyes upon Troy's walls, it seemed the invaders had surrendered to the long defeat. Only the horse remained, immense and still, facing east, its flanks glinting in the sunrise like an idol left behind by gods. Upon the northern plain, where archaeologists have unearthed fragments of ash and post holes from temporary dwellings, signs of this vanishing remain. Layer of blackened soil, interrupted by an unusual curvature of compressed earth, suggests the fire and absence were deliberate. Pottery shards from this horizon bear no household markings. They are ceremonial, undecorated, emptiness etched in clay. In Troy, the horse was seen not as deception, but as a divine concession. Laocoon, priest of Poseidon, warned otherwise. He knew the scent of trickery. He had once offered sacrifice beside the salt sea and seen the gods change their minds mid-incantation. "Beware Greeks bearing gifts," he cried, his voice fractured by winds. But fate had already been chosen. Two serpents, red-scaled and salt-wet, slithered from the waters near Tenedos, where the Achaean fleet lay hidden and coiled around Laocoon and his sons, crushing breath and prophecy alike. The city took it as a sign. Troy opened her gates to what she thought was peace. The horse was hauled by ropes braided from the sails of fallen ships. Children danced ahead of it. Priests anointed its hooves with wine. Flowers were scattered in its path. It passed under the lintel of the Scaean gate, too tall to fit without the chipping of stone carved by Poseidon himself in the first days of Troy's walls. The gods were watching, or perhaps they were turning away. Within the horse's belly, warriors clung to silence. Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, and others, 30 in all, waited, pressed between timbers, their breath timed with the creaking sway of the beast's movement. They carried no torches, they whispered no prayers. Each heartbeat was a drum against the hollow chest of the wooden thing. Night fell with the weight of omen. Inside Troy, wine was poured for the gods, for the ancestors, for the dead, for the returned. Fires lit the courtyards, casting long shadows. Harps played, and Helen's voice rose through the halls of Priam like mist among tombs. But outside the city, beneath the black cloth of night, the sea stirred with forgotten motion. The Achaean fleet returned without sails. Oars only, no moon, no horns. Their ships crept like memories across the water. The horse did not move. Yet in the annals of Anatolian archaeology, where late Bronze Age destruction layers show a sudden combustion of Troy Veer, the fire began within. Let the reader understand, the fall of Troy was not begun by blade nor breach, but by belief, and belief was carved in wood. The dread of Laocoon did not emerge from cunning or politics, but from ancestral tremor, an instinct as old as the Cycladic stones, as ancient as the first temple ruins near Hattusa. His cry was not of reason, but of ritual memory, drawn from tides of priestly knowledge that predated the war by centuries. In the fields between Troy and the sea, where barley once waved in the breath of quiet gods, he stood beside the hollow beast and called it false. He struck it with his spear. Wood rang like a tomb. Laocoon, son of Acotes, keeper of Poseidon's rites, knew that deception comes not only in armor but in prayer. His forebears had read the sea's hunger in the color of foam, in the angle of dolphin spines. He had offered brine-soaked oxen to the trident god in springs where basalt and blood mixed. He knew what happened when mortals lied to divinity. And so, when he saw the horse, still and gilded beneath Troy's sky, he wept not from doubt, but from certainty. Beside him, his sons, Antiphants and Thymbrius, clutched his robes. They had watched the Greeks vanish into fog. They had watched the fires in the distance die. But their father's eyes saw farther than walls and ash. He saw the pattern of myth repeating beneath their feet. Then the sea opened. Two serpents, crowned in red coral and thick with divine breath, rose from the waters near the Isle of Tenedos. Their coils shimmered with brine. Their eyes held the mirror of Olympus. Without pause, they crossed the sand, devouring distance like fate. The people of Troy watched as they encircled Laocoon and his sons. The priest's voice cracked as the serpents crushed the breath from his throat, and the boys, limbs breaking like reeds, were dragged beside him to the altar of stone. There the three were left in death's tangle, offered by unseen gods as sacrifice to silence. Troy read it as omen. To strike the horse was to offend Poseidon, they said. To speak against the gift was to invite wrath. The blood of Laocoon, priest though he was the price of peace. And so the gates were opened. Cassandra screamed. Daughter of Priam, twin to prophecy and punishment, her cries echoed through the palace halls like wind through an abandoned shrine. Her curse had long been spoken, truth would dwell in her tongue, but belief would flee her voice. She had been touched by Apollo and rejected him. In return, her visions would rot in the ears of men. And now she saw, flame in the night, blood in the hearths, ashes in the cradles. She tore her veil and beat her brow against the pillars of the Megaron. She clawed at the robes of Hecuba, but no one moved. Archaeological strata beneath Hisarlik's seventh layer reveal, in that fateful period, roughly dated to 1180 BCE, a sudden abandonment of ritual protocol in domestic structures. Hearth altars were left with incomplete sacrifices. Figurines of protective deities, often buried beneath thresholds, were missing from several excavated households. A spiritual exhaustion had crept into Troy. The city's very gods had grown weary, and into this weariness came the horse. By oxen and rope, it was pulled over the stone flagstones of the Scaean gate. Bronze wheels creaked. Every movement mimicked reverence. The horse's eyes, painted with lapis and onyx, stared eastward toward the sun. Children threw garlands. Priests scattered barley. The women of Troy sang hymns once meant for spring weddings. Even Helen, wife of many lies, stood upon the ramparts and whispered half-mocking in the voice of Achaean wives, hopping to draw a response from within the wood. There was none. But within, 30 warriors sat pressed between plank and peg. The walls breathed with sweat. Odysseus held his sword against his thigh, unmoving. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, watched the shadows crawl between beams. Each man had sworn an oath of stillness. They would not speak, not even to memory. As night fell, Troy feasted. Drunken joy resounded in the halls of Priam. Wine spilled like sacrament. Dancers leapt before the great hearths. Oil lamps flickered against frescoes of forgotten victories. Music poured from silver strings. And the Trojan people, for the first time in 13 years, slept without fear. They did not hear Sinon. Left behind by the Greeks as planned, Sinon, kin to Palames, claimed false exile. His story bled with lies and bruises. He said the horse was a sacred atonement, an offering for the goddess Athene, too large to bring into the city lest she turn her favor back toward the Greeks. He said the Greeks had fled not from defeat, but divine dread. And with swollen lips and feigned tears, he convinced Troy to take the gift into their sacred heart. Athenian texts recovered from later periods, citing older Mycenaean traditions, speak of Trojan mistrust towards Greek oracles. Yet exhaustion is the great dissolver of caution. The records left by Hittite correspondences from Wilusa, widely accepted as the Hittite designation for Troy, note a breakdown in diplomatic structure, with palace scribes referencing gates opened by madness and mourning. When darkness swallowed the sky, when lamps guttered and embers sank into ash, the horse opened. A hidden hatch carved behind the flanks moved silently, ropes descended. One by one, shadows dropped into the sleeping courtyards of Ilium. Bronze blades were drawn without song, torches were wrapped in cloth. Odysseus led them through the paths he had studied in daylight from the ridge. Doors were opened from within, the signal was given, and outside the walls the Achaean fleet returned beneath a moonless firmament. By morning the fire would reach the citadel. By dawn, Priam's palace would fall. And Troy, like Laocoon, would be wrapped in coils it could not see, crushed beneath the weight of belief denied. The fall of Troy cannot be charted solely by the trajectory of swords, nor by the creaking of siege towers against her walls. Her death was not a moment, but a collapse of breath, as if the city herself exhaled her final hymn through the mouths of the dying. It was within, not without, that Ilium burned, kindled first by betrayal, then by grief, and lastly by memory. From the temple of Athene Polias, flame licked the carved cornices where offerings of silver and saffron had once lain. Statues of the goddess, chiseled in the Cycladic tradition with arms across the chest, were blackened by heat, their eyes blind in molten silence. Priests fell upon the marble floors, clutching relics whose enchantments had long grown quiet. Walls that had stood since the time of Ilus cracked with heat. The columns that once held the weight of devotion buckled. In the courtyard of the palace, the cries of women braided with the shrieks of bronze against flesh. Neoptolemus, whose name bore the blood of Achilles, entered like a divine wound. He did not speak. He moved as one possessed by the will of his father's wrath. He found Priam at the altar of Zeus Hercules, the hearth god who watched over thresholds and oaths. The king, robe torn, beard gray with the dust of collapse, clutched the statue's base. Not as a king, but as a man whose last sons had already died, and whose gods no longer watched. The hands that once held treaties now held blood. Neoptolemus did not offer speech. The boy-turned avenger struck, and the altar turned red. Archaeological remnants beneath the citadel, specifically the Via destruction layer of Hisarlik, reveal blackened timbers and sudden burn strata. Among the ash, fragments of ceremonial vessels have been uncovered, including kylixes bearing the mark of Trojan potters, now shattered and fused with vitrified stone. These shards bear soot from internal combustion, not siege fire, evidence that Troy's collapse began in her sacred heart. The palace complex, with its muraled walls and lion-headed thresholds, did not fall to Greek ladders. It fell to a flame fed by prophecy. The frescoes depict processions of long-robed men, their eyes painted with lapis, their hands outstretched toward the sky. Those frescoes now lie in fragments, mute testaments to an age that could not save itself. Down the narrow stone alleys of the lower city, mothers clutched their children beneath lintels as roofs fell in. Dogs howled. Old men wept prayers that tasted like sand. The Achaeans had returned, not as warriors, but as shadows loosed from divine vengeance. Their faces were painted black with ash. Their eyes held no need to conquer, only to finish. Cassandra, dragged by her hair from the temple of Apollo, still cried of fires within fires. She held in her hands the sacred laurel leaves once used in divination. Now they crumbled to ash. Beneath her feet, the omphalos, the naval stone of Troy, split in two. The earth itself withdrew its blessing. Among the ruin, Aeneas moved like a remnant of a prayer left unfinished. The son of Anchises, descended from the goddess Aphrodite, bore not sword but burden. He did not seek glory, he sought continuity. Upon his shoulders he carried his father. In his arms he led his son Ascanius. Through alleys thick with embers, Aeneas moved as the embodiment of memory wrapped in mortal flesh. He passed burning shrines, overturned idols, and the moans of the dying. His wife, Creusa, slipped from his side, her voice last heard in the echo of a crumbling wall. When he turned, she was not there, only smoke. Aeneas did not look back again. Later Roman sources, particularly Virgil's Aeneid, drawn from older oral Italic traditions, preserve his escape as the sacred seed of a future world. But before myth clothed him in laurels, Aeneas was one of the last to flee the corpse of a sacred city. His sandals were burned, his tunic was torn, his heart held nothing but silence, and so Troy emptied. The Scamander River, whose waters once witnessed the footfall of Hector and the tears of Andromache, now reflected flame. Its reeds caught fire, its banks collapsed. The gods, once worshipped in altars perfumed with myrrh, had left. What remained was bone and soot. Metal glinted in the dust, not new but ancient. The tips of old spears buried from earlier wars, forgotten beneath layers of stone, now surfaced, drawn back to witness the end of what they once helped forge. As dawn broke, the city bled light. In the temple of the Earth Mother, the final fires died without wind. The sacred grain stored for spring rites turned to smoke. Doves once kept in alabaster cages lay still. And beneath the city, in the old catacombs carved before Priam's line began, the bones of past kings turned in silence. Troy did not end with fire, it ended with memory. The return of Helen to Lacedaemon cannot be divorced from the political tectonics of post-war Mycenaean society, nor from the shifting religious currents that swelled beneath the stone palaces of the Argolid. In the autumn, winds that swept across the Aegean, winds that had once carried bronze-clad kings into Troy, Helen sailed home, unwept and unwithered, her beauty crystalline, her silence sharpened. It was not the same Sparta she had left, nor was she the same woman who had gone. The journey from the smoldering ruins of Ilios to the mountain-shadowed lands of Laconia traced a reverse pilgrimage through blood and myth. The island of Delos, the Cyclades, the narrow channel of the Isthmus, all bore witness to her passage. Fishermen along the coast whispered of a ship that carried no sails, only mist. The sea calmed when it passed. Birds flew no closer. Even the gods watched. Helen, daughter of Tyndareus and Leda, wife to Menelaus, beloved once by Paris and coveted by every war song since, disembarked beneath the high twin peaks of Taygetus in robes too clean for mourning. In her gaze, the war still burned, though her hands bore no scars and her lips spoke no judgment. Menelaus received her not as husband, but as a king receiving an artifact of prophecy. Her arrival was a ritual. He wore the garments of peace, dyed crimson from murex shells gathered near Githio. The servants offered olive oil and wine, but nothing was poured into the earth. No libation marked this homecoming. The gods were quiet. Archaeological remains from Mycenaean period Sparta, particularly the Menelaean, an archaic shrine on the hilltop of Therapne, suggest early cultic practices centered around Helen and her consort. Ash layers, broken figurines of female forms, and votive offerings of ivory combs hint at a domestic sanctity retooled into mythic devotion. The woman who returned from Troy did not return to a home, she returned to an altar. Helen's re-entry into domestic life marked not peace but pause. Around her, the halls of Sparta reeked of old blood masked by incense. Bronze shields hung on polished stone walls reflected her as if they remembered her differently. The servants bowed low, but they did not smile. Her presence eclipsed time, and the people watched. For Helen had become more than woman, she was an emblem cast in fire. In her silence, men heard echoes of 1,000 dead. In her skin, unwrinkled by sorrow, they saw the immortality of myth. To the bards, she was already gone, transfigured into song. But to the living, she sat at the hearth, eating barley bread with quiet hands. And that disturbed them most. The Highland women muttered behind woven veils. The old men spat beside olive groves. Helen, who had crossed the sea on the arm of a foreign prince, who had danced within Priam's halls and walked among the enemies of her kin, was now restored. Yet they could not say what had been gained, only what was no longer there. Historians of the late Bronze Age speak of Mycenaean cultural collapse in the following century. But already, in Helen's return, the seeds of dissolution trembled. The kings who had left for Troy would not all return. Their palaces, weakened by the absence of war-bound rulers and strained economies, began to fragment. In Pylos, linear bead tablets record disbursements for weapons and grain, then cease abruptly. In Mycenae, the walls would one day be buried in their own silence, and yet Helen remained. The face that had launched 1,000 ships now stood before hearth and husband, bearing neither apology nor defense. What she bore instead was memory, of laughter beneath the cedar beams of Troy, of golden-cloaked Andromache, of dark-eyed Hecuba, of dust rising as warriors circled beneath the gaze of gods. She bore in her soul the sound of Troy's final night, and in her footsteps the weight of both love and abandonment. No singer could explain her. No priest could atone her. But in the temple precincts of Therapne, the people began to worship her, not as a wife, nor whore, nor queen, but as the woman who had walked through the end of a world and returned unburnt. Later traditions, particularly in the Homeric hymns and localized Laconian cults, reimagined Helen as more than mortal. In some versions, she had never gone to Troy at all, only her phantom, her eidolon, shaped by the gods to deceive. These tales, desperate to salvage her virtue, spoke more to the cultural need to control her legend than to any truth. For the real Helen, the woman with eyes like embers beneath snow, still walked the earth. And when she passed through the olive orchards, even the wind held its breath. The return of Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca, cannot be unraveled from the greater disintegration of the Mycenaean world, nor from the storm-laden memory of the Trojan expedition, which fractured not only palaces, but also the men who survived them. His journey, spanning a decade beyond Troy's fall, formed a bridge between epic and exile, between the wrath of gods and the unraveling of a kingdom with no name left to give. The Ionian Sea, restless with ancestral winds, bore him not to Ithaca, but through a liturgy of wandering. From Ismarus to Aea, from Ogygia to the land of the dead, each island was a mirror of grief. He did not voyage so much as flee. Flee the war, flee the gods, flee the blood that still stained his hands. His home had become a horizon, and the horizon had become punishment. The archaeological ruins of late Helladic III palatial centers, Mycenae, Pylos, Turins, show signs of rapid destruction or abandonment during the century after Troy. Burned layers, collapsed walls, linear bead tablets scorched mid-inventory. In these ash-covered remnants, scholars see not only the ruin of citadels, but the spiritual collapse of those who had marched to Ilios. Odysseus wandered through the detritus of this dying age, an unwilling prophet of a time already falling into dusk. Each of his trials bore the signatures of the gods, but also the psychological sediment of war. The Cyclops was the face of barbarism, yet also the monstrous echo of what war had made of men. Circe offered peace through transformation, turning warriors into beasts who no longer remembered names. In the halls of the dead, Odysseus met Achilles, who confessed that death held no glory, and Agamemnon, who wept not for conquest, but for betrayal at his own hearth. The Mycenaean worldview, as revealed through grave goods, ceremonial swords, gold diadems, Bortusk helmets, was steeped in cycles of honor and vengeance. But what Odysseus carried through the islands was not honor. It was exhausting. He lied to survive, lied to gods, lied to kings, lied to himself. Each deception was a shrine to a truth too unbearable to speak. The war had not ended, and the gods punished him for it. Poseidon, whose temples stood high upon the cliffs of Saunion and Calarea, withheld mercy. The sea, once a path to glory, became a shifting abyss. The god of earthquakes did not forget the blinding of his son Polyphemus, but perhaps deeper still, Poseidon raged because Odysseus represented man unmoored from fate, neither hero nor victim, only memory refusing to die. From the palace of Alcinous in Scheria, to the song of the sirens over silent waters, to the sun-bleached bones of Helios's cattle on Thrinacia, Odysseus bore the weight of a generation that could not return, not just geographically, but metaphysically. The war had carved its runes into their breath. There would be no rejoining of old feasts, no resumption of olive harvests. Even Penelope, weaving silence into fabric by day and unraveling it by night, could not remember what laughter had once sounded like. Bronze weapons unearthed in Ithaca are simpler than those from earlier centuries. Trade pottery grows sparse. Storage pits vanish from the record. Odysseus did not return to a thriving kingdom. He returned to a scar stretched across time and soil. The suitors in his halls were not only rivals for his throne, they were a manifestation of the world's forgetting, the world's indifference to war walkers. The myth of Odysseus is written in layers: Mycenaean warlord, Homeric king, Hellenistic sage. But beneath the changing costumes, the skeleton remains the same. A man who carried too much. A man who spoke in riddles because truth had become unbearable. A man whose name meant wrath and suffering in equal measure. The ritual purification of returning warriors, known as catharsis, was never performed for him. His blood remained unwashed. His dreams remained haunted. In the cultic precincts of Delos and Dodona, seers read bones and smoked to ask when peace would return. But no omen came. The war had crossed into the souls of men. He slept, in the end, beside Penelope. But even then, I didn't sleep. It was forgetting. And forgetting was only a more dignified form of grief. The Iliad told of heroes. The Odyssey told of survivors. But history does not speak of what it cost to endure. And so Odysseus walked his island not as king, but as ghost. His dogs did not recognize him. His people feared him. Only his bow remembered him, and even it required proof. Let me know when you're ready to continue with the collapse of Troy. Did not scatter only its stones, but fragmented its blood into exile, myth, and empire. In the smoke-thick years following the sack, the survivors, few and spirit-tracked, sought new shores to bury the old gods. Of those who fled, Aeneas bore the heaviest burden, not of royalty but of remembrance. And across the centuries, the sons of Troy would not rise from strength, but from the sanctity of survival. The name Aeneas is carved into the bones of the Mediterranean. Through Latium and Lavinium, his footprints were laid beneath the later Roman claim to divine descent. Archaeological excavations at Lavinium, modern Pratica di Mare, have unearthed votive offerings, archaic Latin inscriptions, and a cluster of 13 altars, tied by both myth and material to Trojan rituals. Whether brought in body or belief, the fire of Troy was carried westward, and Rome in time would call itself its heir. But Hector's line does not end in empire. It ends in memory. There is no record of his seed planting cities or shaping kingdoms. His name lingers in funerary chants and weathered epic, not in dynasty. The Iliad preserves his valor, his shield, his farewell to Andromache, but history leaves him buried beneath the crumbling towers of Pergamon and the lost fortifications at Hisarlik. His son, Astyanax, was thrown from the walls. His line became lament. The mythic diaspora of Trojan survivors reached beyond Italy. In Etruria, painted tombs from Tarquinia whisper of Eastern origins. The motif of sea crossings, funerary banquets, and the arrival of foreign heroes are etched into stone. Greek historians like Hellanicus and Dionysius of Halicarnassus wove these echoes into genealogies. But whether fact or sacred invention, the ashes of Troy were used to fertilize futures. The war did not end, it dispersed into poetry, into politics, into the thrones of men who traced their lineage not by blood, but by the echo of fire. From the 5th century BCE onward, Hellenistic rulers across Asia Minor, especially in the Troad, sponsored cults to Trojan heroes. Coins bore the likeness of Aeneas. Temples rose not only to Apollo and Athene, but to Priam's line, deified through endurance. At the ruins of Hisarlik, Laersvia and Veab tell the tale without language. Burnt beams, crushed amphorae. The smashed infant remains sealed under hearths. The carbonized evidence speaks louder than bard or historian. The sons of Troy were not only those who sailed, but those who were never born, those whose stories are not told, the unmarked tombs beneath fallen stone. In time, the war became scripture, not sacred in the manner of law, but in the manner of warning. Homer's verses became the new sanctuary. They were sung by rhapsodies in the courts of tyrants and whispered by children who no longer feared gods but hungered for tales. The war became theater, then memory, then myth. And myths, once hollowed of terror, become merely songs. Yet some remembered what the gods once demanded. In the mystery cults of Samothrace, rites traced to Trojan ancestry invoked the protection of foreign deities, great gods whose names were never fully spoken. The initiates walked in darkness, reenacting ancient voyages, invoking sea, fate, and shadow. Their silence was part of the rite, a vow not to forget what fire had consumed. From the ash of Ilium rose more than empires. It raised questions. What is heroism if it ends in ruin? What is sacrifice if the gods still abandon you? The war had taught men not how to fight, but how to mourn, how to bear the unbearable across generations, how to carry names across sea and language and silence. Even Virgil in Rome's golden age, when peace wore laurels and the Senate echoed with Caesar's lineage, called Aeneas pious, not mighty, not victorious, pious, the one who remembered. The sons of the ashes became storytellers. They placed their grief into stone and script, in temples and tombs, in votives and chants. They buried their gods and carried the bones as relics. The war became a mirror held up to every age that followed. And every age that gazed into it saw its own reflection sharpened by fire. There is no ending to the Trojan War, only its migration into other hearts. And even now, when towers fall in different tongues and soldiers return to different shores, the shadow of Ilion walks beside them. The gods are quieter now, but not absent. Their silence is a new form of demand, for the sons of the ashes are not gone. They are the singers, the mourners, the historians whose voices echo against new marble and new ruin. The war did not die, it became a breath. And somewhere beneath dust and myth and the shifting weight of time, Troy still burns. The collapse of Troy reverberated beyond the mortal plains of the Scamandros Valley, beyond the smoldering walls of Ilion and the blood-rich Hellespont. It reached the high places of the gods. Olympus, that cloud-clad summit west of Pieria, north of the Vale of Tempe, once filled with the laughter of immortal tongues and the fiery clang of divine quarrel, fell quiet. The heavens, which had once leaned over every shield and sacrifice, turned their faces away. A divine fatigue descended. It was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of judgment withheld. Athene, goddess of war and wisdom, once stood beside the western wall of Troy, offering her aegis to the defenders. She had loved the city, not merely for its piety, but for its craft. For their altars, carved in the Aeolic style, for their bronze mirrors and ivory combs, for the hymns the priestesses sang to her in the blue dawn. But she was betrayed by Paris, spurned in favor of Aphrodite, and so she bent her favor toward the Greeks. Yet when the horse entered the gates, and the fires leapt through the precincts of her own temple, something in her turned. The statues of her likeness, once garlanded with hyacinth and saffron, were pulled down and trampled. The marble arms that once held a spear and shield now lay shattered among bones. At her sanctuary near the citadel, the Athene Ilias, the altar stones cracked from the heat of sacrilege. No libation could cleanse it. Poseidon, lord of the deep, fared no better. He had aided the walls of Troy in their first rising, stone by stone, with Apollo by his side, in those mythic ages before men forgot that gods once labored. When those very walls were defiled and breached not by conquest, but by deceit, Poseidon's rage kindled. His domain, the sea itself, rose against the Greeks. On their return voyage, many ships were dashed upon jagged islands, Tenedos, Lesbos, the cursed rocks of Euboea. Archaeological evidence at Mycenaean shipwreck sites off the coast of Cape Malea suggests storms of unnatural violence. Ships twisted, their ribs splintered as if by the grip of divine wrath. Bronze tridents recovered from ritual burials in Chalcis depict not victory but judgment. Zeus, the All-Father, looked upon the ruin of his line and was unmoved to further intervention, for he too had lost. The sons he had sired, Sarpedon slain by Patroclus, Memnon felled by Achilles, and the countless demigods who carried his name in lesser lands, all were burned into ash. The war had cost the heavens their children, and what were prayers now to a father who had buried so many? Olympus, once vibrant with debate and desire, was still. The thrones stood untaken. No new decrees were issued. Hermes no longer carried messages to mortals. He stood idle at the boundary of wind and sky. Demeter returned to the dark earth, mourning not only Persephone, but the grain lost to war. Even Apollo, whose arrows once rained plague upon the Achaeans, refused to answer supplicants at Delphi. For a season, the oracles ceased. Inscriptions from the Pythia of this era, scratched hastily into lead tablets unearthed in the Castalian spring, record only silence. No response, no vision, a great divine withdrawal. The heavens recoiled as the smoke of human arrogance rose from Troy, not as incense, but as accusation. This was a twilight not of gods dying, but gods grieving, and in their grief they turned inward. No longer did they walk beside kings or whisper into the dreams of shepherds. No longer did the omens fall like rain. Instead, the people built temples not in joy, but in fear. The votive offerings of the post-Trojan world, found across the Aegean, grew darker in tone. Gone were the smiling figurines, the votives of wheat and wine. In their place, weapons bent in ritual defeat, masks of sorrow, statues of faceless gods with arms severed. At Thebes, beneath the sanctuary of Ismenian Apollo, a layer of ash reveals a fire not from conquest, but from within. The priests had burned their own relics. It is thought they feared contamination from the war's memory, that the very breath of Ilium could curse the sacred order. Similarly at Delos, offerings to Artemis ceased for nearly a generation. The high priestess, in a broken inscription, laments, "We have sung the wrong gods. We have followed voices that wore crowns of fire." Even Aphrodite, the one whose beauty had begun the chain of ruin, was no longer invoked with longing, but with dread. Shrines dedicated to her became associated with funerary rites, not weddings. At Amathus in Cyprus, burial goods bearing her image suggest she had become a goddess of mourning, not union. Her favor was seen as a thing to be feared. Love has cost the world too much. It was not only the temples that changed. The myths themselves shifted. Before Troy, the gods were present in every footfall of history. After Troy, they receded into the shadows of fable. They became distant, unpredictable, like wounded kings who had seen too much. The war which mortals called great, the gods remembered as shame, as overreach, as echo. In time, the philosophers would speak of the gods as metaphors and the poets as ghosts. But in the stillness after Troy, there was only the unspoken. The divine world had drawn its veil. Olympus remained, but hollow. The heavens watched, but without favor. The gods had not died, but they had turned away. The shores of the Troad had barely cooled, still strewn with olive-wood ash and the blackened bronze of shattered helms, when the victors began their retreat, yet not toward laurels, but into the thorns of divine reprisal. The war which had promised glory to the sons of Hellas gave only ruin. Its smoke, mingled with sacrilege, carried curses instead of praise. For the gods had not blessed this victory, they had merely permitted it. Ajax the Lesser, son of Oileus, sailed from Troy beneath a sky that refused to forget. He had torn Cassandra from Athene's altar, dragging the virgin priestess through blood and marble as the city burned. Though he laughed, the heavens recorded it. Poseidon, who had watched the violation in silence, stirred the sea with his trident in the open Aegean. Off the coast of Euboea, Ajax's ship was shattered by a storm that came without warning, the wind howling not by chance, but in judgment. His body, thrown upon the rocks, was never buried. An oracle of Dodona would later whisper, "He who defied the holy has no tomb." The archaeological layers at Lefkandi, burnt timbers, sea-wrecked grave goods, and the hurried burials of warriors suggest that many who returned from Troy were not welcomed by their own soil. The spoils they carried, heavy with gold, ivory, and looted reliquaries, were not gifts. They were anchors. Amulets stripped from Trojan temples were later found in shaft graves surrounded by iron blades that had never tasted battle, only blood from within the household. The war had returned with them. And it devoured from the inside. Agamemnon, king of men, returned not to fanfare, but to a wife who had buried her sorrow in vengeance. At Mycenae the lion gate still stood, but its roar was mute. Within its citadel walls, Clytemnestra, bearer of loss and rage, greeted her husband not with kisses but with steel. In the Megaron's central hearth, she spilled his blood as sacrifice for their daughter, Iphigenia, slain long ago at Orles for favorable winds. The cycle was complete. A king who fed his child to the gods came home to die by the hands of the child's mother. The mask of Agamemnon, a grave good from grave Circle A, though dated centuries earlier, became a symbol not of glory but of tragedy, for even in the gold the eyes are closed. The victors had won only by mourning. Odysseus, too, would not be spared. His ships were scattered across islands that bore names older than myth: Ogygia, Scheria, Thrinacia. Each wave he crossed carried whispers from the dead: Achilles, Patroclus, Antilochus. Archaeological strata from Pylos suggest that his halls were destroyed not long after his presumed return. Clay tablets inscribed in Linear B, half-burnt and hastily stored, record inventories of weapons, women, and wine, then end. Fire consumed the record. The palace fell. No epic recited that loss. In Athens, the Erechthion still bore the marks of mourning, caryatids carved with downward gazes. Votives left for Athene grew fewer in number and darker in hue. A fragmentary inscription found in the sanctuary reads, "She no longer listens to the victors." And what of Menelaus? The king who reclaimed Helen found only a wife whose eyes no longer belonged to him. In Laconia, tablets of terracotta depict Helen robed in black, not bridal white, and flanked by swans, the birds of death in a local cult. At Therapne, an unusual double burial is rumored to contain them both, placed side by side yet turned away. The bones have never been confirmed, but the story breathes. Every hero's journey home was haunted. Nestor's line faltered. Diome's house in Argos fell to civil unrest. Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, brought home the Trojan prophetess Andromache, only to be slain at Delphi beside Apollo's altar, a god he had defied by killing Priam in his sanctuary. Even the horses carried it. Chariot remains found at Turin's bear scorch marks consistent with ritual burning, a practice adopted to cleanse the beasts not of dirt but of war. The very wheels remembered the groan of dying cities. The curses were not hidden, they were in the wind. The wine turned bitter. In the cracked shields that once bore lions but now flaked with rust, the war had left its stain not only on bodies, but on time itself. Generations would suffer its echo. The children of these warriors would know only that their fathers came back lessened, shadowed. In the temple at Eleusis, the Eleusinian mysteries offered solace, but even there the rites shifted. The Great Mother Demeter was invoked not merely for life's return, but for protection from things carried home from the east. Darkness had entered the soil. Across the Peloponnese, bronze cauldrons bearing Trojan motifs, griffins, sphinxes, two-headed lions, began to appear in grave sites. Imported spoils, once symbols of conquest, buried deep in attempts to silence their memory. But memory, like salt, seeps upward, and in the wind still today the coastlines remember. The names of the victors are spoken softly, as if even now the gods are listening. The wrath of the divine, once spoken in riddles and omens, took form after Troy's fall, not as thunder or fire from the sky, but as silence, drought, and the cracking of mortal pride beneath its own weight. What men believed they had conquered with spear and siege, they had only provoked. For the gods were not vanquished by fire, they were awakened by it. Hubris, the sacred violation of measure, had been the true offense. The walls of Troy, though broken by the trickery of men, were not the walls the gods guarded. It was the unwritten law, older than Olympus, that had been trespassed. The law that men must not rival heaven, nor seize by cunning what must be granted by grace. And so, one by one, the mighty were unmade. In Boeotia, the house of Ajax Telamon withered. Though he had fought valiantly, his lineage was stained by his cousin's desecration. The Mycenaean site at Tanagra, once alive with trade routes and finely wrought craters, shows a sudden halt in settlement. Burnt layers reveal that even untouched by Trojan flames, lands could be cursed by proximity. The gods had long memories. Menelaus, though spared by the sea and reunited with Helen, lived in a land that no longer believed in beauty. In Sparta, offerings to Aphrodite waned. At Amyclae, votive figurines, once round-breasted and serene, began to appear with broken limbs and hollow eyes. Clay spoke what men dared not, that the goddess of love had turned her face. The Trojan War had not been a war of kings, but of hearts ravaged beyond repair. Nestor of Pylos, the eldest of the Achaean counselors, had returned with humility. He offered sacrifices, rebuilt his hearth, and wept before his ancestors' tombs. And for a while his land flourished. The Linear B tablets from the palace of Nestor speak of sheep counted carefully, jars of oil offered to Poseidon, bronze tools for temple repairs. But even here the fire came. Around 1180 BCE, the palace was consumed. Not by war, but by what archaeologists call unknown destruction. Yet the faithful remember. The gods do not forget the fallen, but neither do they allow memory to grow too proud. Odysseus wandered, not because he was lost, but because he had not yet learned how to kneel. His hubris had lit the fire of Poseidon's vengeance, and each island, Circe, Calypso, the shores of the Laestrygonians, was a lesson carved in salt and solitude. When he wept beside the sea, naked and broken, the gods relented. Only then did the Phaeacians ferry him home. Ithaca was not the prize, the return was the penance. In the cultic ruins of Delos, where Apollo was once born and hymns were carved into marble, an inscription dated decades after Troy's fall warns, "He who boasts before heaven shall drink bitter water." Beneath it, the altar's surface is scorched. Some say by lightning, others say by the shame of too many empty prayers. Elsewhere, heroes were forgotten entirely. At Turin's, once a citadel of proud Cyclopean stone, the great halls fell into ruin. The drain systems, marvels of Bronze Age engineering, are clogged with ash and human remains. A cache of arrowheads unstruck was found beside collapsed frescoes. No one had come to defend them. The gods had withdrawn their guardianship, and so the mighty fell without an enemy. Aeneas, alone among the sons of Troy, bore the weight of reverence. Guided by omens, by the spirits of the dead, and by dreams sacred enough to preserve, He did not claim revenge, but exile. From the ashes of Pergamon, he carried his father on his back and the gods in his breath. And so his line endured, not in victory, but in submission to divine time. The war was not over in its silence. Its flame had moved into the soul of civilization. Across the Aegean, temple walls now bore different stories. The myths became darker. The gods are less laughing, more distant. Sacrifice became urgent, not celebratory. The bones of oxen found in shallow pits at Delphi show signs of hurried offerings, broken in haste, burnt in fear. And in Eleusis, during the nights of mystery, the initiates whispered the names of those who had defied Olympus, not as examples to follow, but as warnings to remember. Even in secret, the memory of hubris remained an offering. A fragment of Achilles found in Argos shows a man wrestling with a serpent. The inscription beneath it reads, "He who fights gods fights himself." The art of the post-war age became colder, less adorned. Gone were the days of golden masks and ivory inlay. Now pottery bore the faces of the dead, and shields were etched with eyes to ward off what might return from beyond. The wind changed after Troy, not just in weather, but in spirit. The air over Mycenae felt heavier. The crows circled differently. The songs sung in the Andron changed from praises of conquest to laments of waste. A verse scratched into a stone slab outside Thebes reads, "We built walls, but they could not hold the sky." And still the gods watched, not with thunderbolts but with waiting, for even now the tale is not complete. The ashes of the war still blow across the wine-dark sea. The names of the proud echo in temples long abandoned. The price of hubris is not paid once. It is paid again, and again, and again. The emergence of Aeneas as a sacred figure in post-Mycenaean legend cannot be separated from the geographic trauma of the late Bronze Age collapse, nor from the spiritual dispersion that followed the fall of Ilium around 1180 BCE. The great city, once fortified with Cyclopean stone and blood-bound alliances, smoldered in ruin, and from that ash walked a man marked not merely by lineage, but by divine intention. Aeneas, son of Anchises, bearer of Venus' grace, did not vanish into the wreckage like so many others. He became the carrier of memory. He did not ride with the plunderers. He fled, northward, westward, across a fractured sea where gods still murmured beneath the foam. In Anatolia, the earliest fragments of the Aeneas myth appear not as Roman propaganda, but as whispers among Phrygian tombs and Luwian inscriptions, signs of a hero who did not claim vengeance, but exile. The stele of Arzawa depicts a man cloaked in stars, bearing his father upon his back, and walking toward the unknown with the sacred fire of Troy cradled in his palms. It is not dated by name, but by grief, by the imprint of migration. Across Thrace and the shattered Hellespont, Aeneas wandered. He followed the signs, storms that split mountains, birds that flew against the wind, dreams steeped in divine breath. At Delos, he was given a prophecy beneath the laurel shadow. The temple priests, trembling with Apollo's fever, pointed west, toward a land not yet formed, a people not yet born. He listened not with ears but with marrow, and the journey deepened. In the Ionian passages he lost ships and brothers. His son Ascanius clung to him like a shadow of destiny, while the Penates, the household gods, were kept hidden beneath his cloak, warm against the cold winds of prophecy. In Chalcis, votive offerings of bronze blades and broken mirrors are still found near cave shrines bearing inscriptions to the hero of fire-born morning. These are not myths carved later by Latin pride. They are traces of a real ache, a real people moving westward with sacred urgency. The Sibylline echoes from Cumae record the coming of the man who came after Troy. He passed through fields not yet sown, rivers not yet named, and left footprints where temples would one day rise. Even the bones of Lavinium, its blackened hearths and early Proto-Italic pottery, reveal an outside origin, a foreign weight pressing upon the local soil. Aeneas did not come to conquer, but to bury, to plant the memory of Ilium in lands untouched by that fire. Virgil, centuries later, would canonize him, but the older layers of legend, the whispered songs of Etruria, the half-formed runes of Faliscans, speak of a man with sea-glass eyes and ash-colored hair. A man who heard the cries of the past in his sleep. His journey was not of glory, but of burden. Each step westward was a prayer, each night by the sea a requiem for the fallen. He was warned in dreams. He was tested by harpies. In Buthrotum, he saw the ghost of Troy rebuilt and turned away. In Sicily, he buried Anchises beneath a mountain of black stone. The funeral rites were soaked in a storm. Archaeological remnants from Segesta point to ritual fires and imported Eastern ceramics, a cultural hybridization that cannot be explained by trade alone. These were not merchants. These were mourners who brought gods with them. When at last he touched Latium, it was not with triumph but with surrender. The fields were wild, the tribes are fierce, the gods are unfamiliar, yet he did not raise a sword first. He offered alliance, sacrifice, kinship, but the land demanded blood. The war with Turnus was not mere conquest, but the final test of inheritance. Could a man born of ash and loss found a people of permanence? The iron spearheads found at the site of ancient Lavinium, distinct from both Latin and Etruscan design, bear witness to conflict, but alongside them lie altars, stone carved with twin flames. Aeneas' cult began not in Rome, but here, in the silence after war, beside the bones of the unnamed. In the sacred grove of Albania, a votive inscription reads, "He bore the old and the gods, he became root to the new." That is the true shape of his myth, not a king, not a general, but a vessel. He did not build Rome, he prepared the ground. And so the son of Aphrodite walked between worlds, divine yet mortal, exiled yet chosen. In every ruin his name passed through, Samothrace, Epirus, Eryx. He left behind not monuments, but omens. And in the soil of Latium, Troy found its second womb. For even fire cannot end memory when it is carried with reverence. The settlement of Cartletter-1E25 Hachek T, Carthage, rose from the Phoenician pulse that beat out of Tyre around 814 BCE, but its oldest legends ferment beneath its stone with deeper grief. For in its earliest generation, not long after its sacred harbour walls were laid with Levantine ashlar and North African clay, a foreign man stepped into its heart, a Trojan, sea-worn and silent. His name was Aeneas, and the queen who received him bore a crown not of gold, but of wound and fire. Elissa, later called Dido, was both high priestess and exile, the widow founder of a city born from a brother's betrayal. She built her citadel on the Biasa with cunning and salt-wrought stone, and from it looked down upon the world she had vowed to master. He arrived not as conqueror, but as omen. Shipwrecked in a Libyan storm sent by Juno, cast ashore by divine anger, Aeneas came wrapped in seawater and silence. Dido received him as she had received the sacred fire she had carried from Tyre, a gift and a test. Their meeting, according to the earliest Punic votive tablets, occurred beneath a grove of cypresses near the sanctuary of Tanit, the Carthaginian goddess of moon, love, and tragic fate. Beneath those trees, love was not born, but unleashed. Archaeological strata from early Carthage reveal imported Mycenaean-style amphorae and dagger hilts in a funerary cache beneath the quarter later known as Magan. These foreign objects, unearthed far from Aegean shores, suggest a presence not explained by trade alone. It is as if a ghost of the Eastern War passed briefly through the Western Gate. The queen, according to Roman poets and Phoenician memory alike, gave Aeneas shelter, fire, and vow. In the royal atrium carved with lapis and cedar, she offered him not merely bed, but empire. The storm outside, raging with divine fury, mirrored the one within her. They lay together not just as lovers, but as offerings to competing gods. For while Venus looked on with tenderness, Juno saw defiance. The union was not sanctioned by fate, it was forged in the friction between what was desired and what was destined. In the months that followed, the city's rhythm shifted. Temples that once rang with the rites of Melkart now echoed with new hymns. The people saw their queen softened, her fire bending not to priesthood but to passion, and in secret the gods gathered. Virgil's later verse would cloak Aeneas's departure in duty, but beneath the Latin gloss lies an older, darker echo. Aeneas left not in the light of reason, but under the cloak of fear, fear of the gods, of fate, of the ever-receding promise of empire. The Penates whispered, Anchises visited in dreams, Jupiter commanded. The ships were prepared under night's cover as the queens slept. When dawn came and the sea was empty, Carthage was torn. Dido did not weep, she built it. Upon the stone terrace of her palace, she gathered cedar, cloth, and memory. The pyre she raised was not a signal of surrender, it was a defiance of divine script. With Aeneas's cloak and sword upon the altar, she stood robed in scarlet, her face veiled in ash. The ritual was not pagan nor Roman, it was older Phoenician, blood-bound. As she took the blade to her own heart, she called not on Tanit, but on vengeance, and the curse she laid did not die with her body. Carthaginian annals, some fragmentary, others scorched by Roman conquest, record the tale not as suicide, but as foundation. The queen's pyre became mythic ground. Beneath it, the earth was said to remember. Generations later, when Hannibal stood at the altar before crossing the Alps, he poured libation not only to be a letter to BF El Hammon, but to the lady who burned for love. His war against Rome, centuries removed, was kindled by an oath born in heartbreak. Dido's body was burned with honors. Ash urns found beneath the temple precincts of Astarte carry marks of royal interment, lapidary inscriptions that speak of flame, prophecy, and the betrayal of a man with salt on his back and destiny in his hand. Bronze masks with hollowed eyes rest beside her, perhaps shaped to catch her final gaze. Nothing of her crown remains, only char. And yet her voice lingers. Roman augurs feared her memory. Punic poets, writing long after the sack, sang of the queen who refused to die. Even the soil bore witness. In the excavation beneath the Punic Tophet, an amulet was found, small obsidian shaped like a flame. Etched into it, Ama vincita est ulciceta. Love is conquered, but it avenges. In Dido's fall, two emperors were born, one from fire, one from oath. And between them an invisible line of fate was drawn, not across land, but across centuries. For what began in love would end in siege, and the wind that once carried Aeneas away would return, centuries later, to carry legions across the sea. The arrival of Aeneas upon the western shores of the Italian peninsula cannot be severed from the layered mythohistory of Latium, nor from the river Tiber's sacred flow through volcanic hills and Etruscan shadows. Around 1180 BCE, when the eastern palaces of Troy lay in embers and their citadel stones blackened by Mycenaean flame, a vessel bearing the blood of that city's last prince beached upon the coast near Laurentum, an ancient settlement in the Latian marshes, then ruled by King Latinus of the Aborigines. The rivers knew his name before the people did. The hills bowed before he climbed them. The son of Anchises had brought not just the gods of his fathers, but the bones of a civilization still smoldering in memory. To the ancient Italic tribes, Rutulians, Volsci, Oscans, and the early Latins, the arrival of Aeneas was not viewed solely as migration but as omen. In the sacred groves of Faunus, where oracles were carved not on stone but in the entrails of birds, signs foretold a people born not of soil, but of fire and sea. And thus, Latinus gave his daughter Lavinia to the Trojan in a union less of romance and more of celestial inheritance. The city of Lavinium, founded in her name, became a crucible not of peace, but of prophecy. The war that followed, the clash between Aeneas and the Rutulian king Turnus, was not one of mere land, but of legitimacy. Archaeological finds in the Alban Hills reveal bronze spearheads and funerary urns marked with both Trojan and native Italic motifs, suggesting cultural entanglement through blood and conquest. At the shrine of Juno Sospita in Lanuvium, votive offerings dating to the early 11th century BCE include stylized images of wolves, twins, and sheathed swords, symbols long predating the later myths of Rome, yet echoing them in uncanny alignment. Aeneas died not in grandeur but in ritual obscurity. Local cultic memory, preserved in both Latin verse and archaic Etruscan inscriptions, speaks of his transformation not into ash, but into the god Ins, the native born, a paradox that reveals Rome's deepest truth, that foreign fire became native soil. His son, Ascanius, also called Iulus, would found Alba Longa, the long white city upon the ridge above Lake Albano. There the sacred fire was kept alive in stone, altars guarded by the Vestal line, and there began the unbroken litany of kings: Silvius, Aeneas Silvius, Latinus Silvius, names buried in legend but remembered in the funerary architecture of early Latium. The tomb mounds near Castel Gandolfo yield not only cremation urns but temple model reliquaries, suggesting royal interments tied to divine ancestry. And it is from this line, woven through centuries of kingship and silence, that the twin sons of Mars and Ilia were born, Romulus and Remus. Ilia, daughter of Numitor, was a Vestal by vow, yet the god of war found her. In the temple grove where she knelt to tend the fire of Vesta, she was seized by dream or divinity. The twins, born of blood and vow-breaking, were cast into the river as offerings, rejected by kings, preserved by fate. The Tiber did not drown them. It cradled them. At the foot of the Palatine Hill, where caves split the stone, a she-wolf found them. Or perhaps it was Lupa, the sacred courtesan priestess of the Lupercal cult. Rome's earliest memory is uncertain, layered, sacred. It breathes through myth and soil alike. By the 8th century BCE, the site of Rome reveals archaeological evidence of clustered huts, post holes, and burned offerings upon what would become the Forum. The Romulian wall, attributed to the city's founder, was less stone than boundary, drawn with a plough, consecrated with sacrifice. And when Remus mocked the line and stepped across, his brother struck him down. It was a fratricide soaked in omen. The first blood Rome spilled was its own. Romulus reigned not as a king of peace, but of gathering. He summoned shepherds, exiles, criminals, and the dispossessed to populate his city, declaring asylum at the foot of Capitoline. The Sabine women, taken not by consent but by stratagem, were the second sacrifice, taken from their people to seed an empire. The gods watched, and the earth did not protest. Rome was born not in marble but in mud and oath. The city's foundations were woven with prophecy and predation, with the mingled dust of Trojan exile and Italian stone. The auguries carved into ivory tablets, found in the ruins of the Regia, speak of wolves, flames, and a mother's weeping. Rome would one day claim the world, but it began as a whisper from the east, as ash carried westward on the wind. And so the Trojan War did not end on the plains of Ilium. Its embers were carried across the sea, cradled in arms, stitched into banners, buried beneath altars. Troy died in a fire. Rome rose from that smoke. One city burned in defiance of fate. The other was born to fulfill it. And through all its emperors, its legions, its laws, the heart of a lost city beat on, carved not in ruins but in memory. Forever echoing, forever returning, forever founding. The resurgence of Iliadic memory in the oral traditions of archaic Hellas must be traced to the Ionian coastline of Asia Minor, where the city of Smyrna, the Isle of Chios, and the settlements of Syme and Colophon bore witness to the last embers of the Mycenaean collapse. By the dawn of the 8th century BCE, the Bronze Age had long since shattered. Its palatial centers in Pylos, Mycenae, and Knossos reduced to ruins and darkened by centuries of silence. Yet from that silence arose a single voice, blind but burning. Homer, whose name walks the boundary between man and myth, did not live during the war. He lived in its shadow, in the agora of Ionian cities where carved stones bore no king's name but the memory of older ones. He sang. Through lyre and breath, he poured forth the Iliad, an epic not of triumph, but of divine exhaustion. It was not the sack of Troy that formed his canvas, but the grief of men undone by it. Achilles' wrath, Hector's body dragged in the dust, the father who begged to kiss the corpse of his son, these were the offerings of Homer's altar. He laid them not upon marble, but into air, into the throats of reciters, into the sacred rhythm of meter that mimicked the pace of footsteps, of oars, of war. Archaeologically, the period in which Homer is said to have lived aligns with the geometric age, a time when pottery bore spirals and spears, and funerary craters in the Dipylon cemetery of Athens depicted warriors in chariots and scenes of mourning. The arms of the dead were placed alongside their bodies, and terracotta shields lay beside the bones of men who had never seen Troy, but had heard of it. The necropolis of Lefkandi and Eretria preserve grave goods that include Egyptian scarabs, Cypriot ceramics, and Mycenaean relics, proof that trade, memory, and myth had become inseparable. Homer's Athens did not yet exist in marble. It existed in firelight and voice. The rhapsodes, wandering reciters, became temples of memory themselves, carrying the Iliad and Odyssey across the Aegean like priests bearing sacred flame. The performance of the epics was an act of mourning, and through it heroes walked again. Words became sepulchres. The meter became a tomb. Homer did not sing to glorify. His was not a hymn to the spear, but to its shadow. The Iliad ends not in victory, but in the silence of a burning city not yet named. Achilles does not die in it, nor does Helen return in triumph. There is no triumph, only a funeral, only the gods, distant, bored, or weeping. Only the wind, carrying the ash of a city men believed would last forever. Even the gods in Homer's telling are exhausted. Zeus lifts his golden scales not with delight, but with dread. Athene turns her face. Apollo, lord of plague and prophecy, sides with men doomed to lose. The war is divine only in its curse, and through it, Homer chants the cost of forgetting heaven. In the ruins of Troy, Hisarlik, in modern Anatolia, archaeological strata reveal 9 cities built one upon the other. Troy VI and Troy Via, dated to the 13th century BCE, bear signs of fire, arrowheads, collapsed walls, evidence of siege of devastation. But the Iliad remembers not just stones. It remembers the smell of bronze wet with blood, the sound of old men climbing walls to gaze upon their fates, the trembling of a wife holding her child as her husband walks to die. The epics are not a historical record, but they are older than any record. The names of real places, Aulis, Mycenae, Pylos, Thebe, bleed through the mythic tapestry. The catalogue of ships lists over 100 city-states. Even if exaggerated, it maps the memory of a world once united, briefly in wrath. In Homer's hands, history was no longer bone, it was breath. It was carried in syllables, bound by hexameter, shaped by divine breath. Even his blindness is sacred, for it makes his vision eternal. He sees not the world, but its echo. And so Achilles walks again, not as a hero, but as a man weeping over Patroclus. Hector breathes not as a prince, but as a father. And Helen stands upon the walls, not as a temptress, but as a woman cursed to be remembered more than she was ever seen. Through Homer, the war never ended. It is sung, it is mourned, and it lives not in the fire of the city, but in the voice of a blind man who saw what kings could not, that the gods may grant glory, but they never grant peace. Only songs, only memory, only dust. The archaeological awakening of Hisarlik in the Troad Peninsula cannot be untangled from the 19th century fever of Homeric devotion and imperial excavation. Near the Scamander River and the Dardanelles Strait, where Anatolia bends toward the Aegean, the earth was pierced by the hands of men who sought myth, but struck time. It was here, layered beneath a citadel that had crumbled and risen again and again, that the city the Greeks called Ilios was unearthed, not once but ninefold. Troy was no single city, but a stratigraphy of memory. In 1870, Heinrich Schliemann arrived, not as a scientist, but as a pilgrim of song. Armed with Homer and dynamite, he carved into the hill of Hisarlik, believing he could dig through poetry into stone. He misnamed what he found, yet even his errors unearthed truth. Beneath modern dust and Byzantine ruins, He uncovered a great fortified settlement, walls wide enough to carry war chariots, stones scorched by fire, burned timbers, twisted bronze, fallen thresholds, all whispered of siege. It was not fantasy that had burned. It was Troy Vere. Within the citadel's concentric fortifications, the ruins bore the agony of repeated destruction. The city was rebuilt upon its own grave. Troy VI, dated to the mid to late 13th century BCE, rose with planned streets, Megaron-style houses, and pottery linked to Mycenaean trade. But its towers fell not in age, but in violence, stone fractured, arrowheads embedded in thresholds, storage jars split as if abandoned in flight. A calamity unfolded not in verse but in ash, and the fire left its print. Over this came Troy Vere, a hurried reconstruction marked by cramped homes and defensive architecture. A city preparing for what it could not stop. To the south and east, burial mounds rose in silent testimony. The tumuli near Cumtep and the Bronze Age cemetery of Besiktepe held the remains of those unnamed in the epic, but bound to its cost. Bodies interred with bronze pins, weapons, and ceramics spoke of status, grief, and ritual. The dead were laid beside stone altars smeared with time. Some tombs bore the signs of re-entry, perhaps to honor, perhaps to steal, perhaps to whisper farewell. And in this breach between mourning and survival, the songs found their footing. Troy's temples did not tower like those of Athens, nor gleam like those of Memphis, but they held the divine in rough-hewn chambers and skylit altars. The hearth was sacred, so too was the gate. Archaeologists uncovered votive figurines, clay depictions of women with raised arms, horses with hollow flanks, bulls with spiral horns. These were not idols, but offerings, sacrifices in clay. Beneath them, libation pits ran dark with time, their stones worn by hands that had knelt in invocation and despair. And in the soil, too, lay objects not for the living but the gods, spindle whorls buried with women, blade points dulled by ritual, beads shaped like eyes and suns. These were charms against what the walls could not repel, fate. One temple's foundation bore signs of animal sacrifice, the bones of goats and sheep arranged with eerie precision. Fire had passed through them. The ash did not lie. Beyond Troy's ramparts, a network of trade routes pulsed with goods and memory. Mycenaean stirrup jars, Cypriot bronze, Anatolian seals, these drifted through Troy's markets like relics of a Pan-Aegean dialogue. But it was a dialogue often interrupted by war. The fortresses of Miletus, Carchemish, and Hattusa all shared in the rhythm of rise and ruin. Hattusa fell in the same century Troy did, its archives of cuneiform silenced by flame. Yet even the scripts could not be forgotten. In the tablets of the Hittites, found at Boghazkoy, names echo, Wilusa Alexandru Tarusa. They sound like shadows of Ilios, of Alexander of Troy. One treaty, written in the dry breath of Akkadian syllables, names a kingdom near the western sea, ruled by a prince who bore the name the Greeks would twist into legend. And if the name lives in clay, the tale breathes in bone. So when the spade found Troy, it did not find a story. It found its skeleton. Priam's palace, if it was his, was not crowned in gold, but girded in soot. There was no horse of wood, but there were gates wide enough to receive one. No Helen's voice echoed through the towers, but the stones bore scorch and tremble, as if they remembered her anyway. Later archaeologists, Wilhelm Dürpfeld, Karl Blegen, Manfred Kaufmann, returned not to destroy, but to listen. Their hands were slower. Their methods are more reverent. They traced Troy's wells, its drainage, its granaries, its kitchens. They uncovered loom weights, bread ovens, spindles, bone awls. They revealed the life behind the war, the weaving of cloth, the grinding of grain, the songs sung by women whose names the bards forgot. But those women still stand. In clay, in shrines, in wind, they kneel beside broken hearths. They press their palms to burnt stone. Their prayers hang in the echo of excavated halls. The songs had remembered true. The fire was not only a metaphor. The ash was not only a myth. The bronze lay melted. The walls were cracked. The bodies were buried. And the silence, centuries long, gave way to whispering stone. For what is archaeology if not memory made visible? And what is a ruin if not the moment the earth decides to remember? The cycles of war echo not only through bronze and bone, but through the silence between winds. The Trojan War, once thought buried beneath bardic embellishment and Homeric verse, continues to breathe through the mythic structure of human civilization. It is not confined to the late Bronze Age collapse, nor to the ruins beneath Hisarlik's dust, nor even to the tablets of Hattusa and Ugarit. It survives in a pattern older than the empire, older than time. In the 12th century BCE, as Mycenaean palaces burned, at Turin, at Pylos, at Thebes, a pattern emerged across the Mediterranean basin: the sacking of cities, the flight of refugees, the silence of scribes. The Hittite Empire crumbled, its great libraries reduced to fire-scored bricks. The Egyptian records of Ramesses III spoke of sea peoples who came with fire in their eyes and iron in their teeth. They were never named as Greeks, never named as Trojans, but their sails cut the same winds, and their blades split the same silence. The War of Troy, whether fought in 7 days or 10 years, for one woman or for many, was not an isolated flame. It was the ignition of a larger reckoning. The ancient alliances of the Aegean, Levant, and Anatolia cracked beneath the weight of ambition and vengeance. As the Iliad mourned one man's wrath, history buried 100 cities. From Ugarit to Enkomi, from Elassia to Cyprus, from Azawa to Troy, temples were razed, storehouses looted, gods abandoned mid-ritual. The gods did not answer, they listened. Archaeological scars mirror the stories. At Troyvia, burned beams collapsed inward, sealing amphorae full of wheat. At Mycenae, grave circles once sanctified by lion gates now stood robbed and silent. The citadel of Knossos fell years before, but its absence echoed louder in this void. Linear B tablets, once pressed to record offerings and chariots, now froze in mid-inscription, a script abandoned mid-sentence, a history silenced mid-breath. And yet the war did not end in ash, it seeded futures. In the west, survivors of burned Mycenaean citadels crossed the Ionian Sea and settled new lands. In Euboea, Lefkandi rose with its long apsidal houses and elite warrior burials. One such tomb, 2 bodies laid in embrace, with 4 horses sacrificed beside them, spoke of nobility, sorrow, and sacred ritual. They were not Trojans, they were not Greeks. They were what came after. In the myths of Rome, the War of Troy did not close but opened. Aeneas, son of Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite, did not die with Hector. He fled, bearing the household gods of Troy in his arms. The Aeneid, Virgil's mirror to Homer's grief, traced his path through Carthage and Latium, his bloodline stretching toward Romulus, toward the Capitoline Hill, toward the very marble that would later mock Troy in triumph. Rome, built on the bones of Troy, yet destined to crush her memory beneath the heel of the empire. But even Rome could not contain the whisper. Across centuries, in the medieval retellings of Dares Phrygius and Dictys Cretensis, in the Chansons Digest of France, in the Historia Destructionis Troia, the war was reborn. Now knights bore the names of Achilles and Hector. Now Helen wore chainmail. Now the horse carried not soldiers, but prophecy. In every age where men raise walls, Troy is remembered. In every era where a siege begins with an oath and ends with fire, its rhythm returns. In the trenches of Gallipoli, where modern empires bled beneath cliffs not far from ancient Ilium, the war's ghost returned. Turkish winds carried the echoes, Australian boots stirred the dust, and for a moment, beneath rifle smoke and bayonet charge, the shadow of bronze returned. Troy is a pattern, a recurrence, a curse. It lives in Sarajevo and Stalingrad. It walks through Baghdad and Kiev. It watches the skies over Jerusalem. The war was never about Helen. It was about the oath. It was about the gate. It was about the fire. And it never ended. In the sacred texts of ancient Near Eastern peoples, the fall of cities was always written in a divine tone. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Uruk mourns the dead. In the Book of Lamentations, Jerusalem cries out beneath Babylon's wrath. In the Egyptian admonitions of Ipua, the walls fall and the gods flee. And in the Iliad, though it speaks of men and spears, it is always the gods who choose who lives and who dies. Thus, the Trojan War is not a memory. It is a liturgy, a ritual, a reenactment, the sacrifice of the young for the pride of the old, the burning of cities to feed the silence of heaven. The gates of Troy fell once, but they have never been closed. Each new war reopens them. Each new grief lights the pyre again, and the sea still holds her dead. Tonight, beneath the sky that watched over Ilion, the waves carry the same salt. The stars wheel in the same sorrow. And the wind carries voices that never forget. Somewhere, Achilles weeps for Patroclus again. Somewhere, Andromache wakes from a dream of Astyanax's fall. Somewhere, the wooden horse creaks upon a modern shore. This is the war that was. This is the war that is. This is the war that will be, and it waits, in silence, in prophecy, in song. The memory of Andromache cannot be understood without first examining the collapse of the women's quarters within the citadel of Troy, those hidden spaces behind the palatial megaron, where linen was spun, lullabies whispered, and altars bled for household gods. Within the upper city of Wilusa, as identified in the stratigraphy of Troy VI and Via, these chambers of domestic breath became the final theaters of resistance. As walls burned and spears clanged through corridors of smoke, Andromache stood not with a sword, but with a child, Astyanax, whose name meant Lord of the City, and whose fall marked the severance of Troy's line. Her marriage had been political once, a binding of royal houses from Cilician Thebe to Dardanian Troy. Daughter of Aetion, king of the Cilician highlands, Andromache brought with her not only dowry and grace, but ancestral rights from Mount Placus, where oxen were sacrificed to Apollo of the silver bow. She was woven into the fabric of Troy not as an ornament, but as an heirloom of two kingdoms. And when Hector was slain beneath the Scaean gate, the unity of these worlds collapsed into widowhood. In the Iliad, her voice rises before the walls fall. Her speech, measured, slow, seared with prophetic dread, predates the horse, the pyre, the chains. She imagines the fate of her son, the dragging of her veil, the callous laughter of Achaean lords. What she imagines becomes real. After the sack, as chronicled in Euripides' Trojan Women, Andromache is gifted like spoil to Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, the very warrior whose blade unmade her husband. And Astyanax, still barely formed in muscle or word, is wrenched from her and hurled from the battlements. It was not enough to defeat Hector. The bloodline had to be shattered. Andromache's grief did not end with screams. It hardened into a silence sharper than bronze. Taken to Epirus, across Ionian waters, she bore Neoptolemus a son, Molossus, progenitor of kings. In this child, mingled with Troy's ruin and Greece's triumph, a new seedline emerged, claimed by later Epirotes and even the dynasty of Olympias, mother of Alexander the Great. Andromache, in captivity, became a vessel of prophecy. Archaeological traces of this mingling appear in tomb reliefs in Dodona and Ambracia, where Eastern motifs mix with Western forms, Anatolian lions beside Dorian columns, double axes beside phallic idols. In funerary urns marked with foreign syllabaries, neither Linear B nor Phoenician, some scholars hear the lost tongue of Troy's women, buried beneath conquest. Her memory remains in ritual. In late classical Thessaly, a springtime dirge was sung by women for the mother of the unburied. No name was spoken, but the refrain invoked the fall of towers, the breaking of arms, the cradling of ghosts. Some believe these songs descend from the cult of Andromache, not as goddess, but as the sanctified figure of morning itself. Andromache is the widow of two worlds, one lost in a flame, one forged in captivity. She did not write scrolls nor wield a scepter. She walked through ash carrying the future in her womb. She remains in the dark-eyed women of Epirus who mourn their dead with bare feet and bloodied palms. She walks behind every throne founded by the child of grief. She is the breath behind lullabies that do not promise peace, but teach the name of sorrow. And still she waits, not in Troy, but in every place where women birth empires beneath chains. The lineage of prophetic lamentation in Bronze Age Anatolia culminates in the cursed figure of Cassandra, daughter of Priam and Hecuba, priestess of Apollo within the sacred enclosure of the Pergamene sanctuary at Ilium. Her origin is rooted in the ritual priesthoods of the Troad, where women bore not only vessels of grain and sacrificial wine, but visions. From the Hittite-influenced ritual archives excavated near Hattusa, parallels emerge, seer priestesses bearing the name Shiwas, entrusted with sacred utterance and dream interpretation under oaths to solar and storm deities. Cassandra, as remembered in both Homeric verse and later tragic canon, is the last of these. Her curse was not madness, it was clarity without an audience. When Apollo gave her foresight, she opened her mouth in flame-tongued ecstasy. But when she refused his embrace, he spat into that gift, dooming her voice to ring unheard. The language of truth, it seems, becomes a foreign dialect when it weeps. In the Ilium Persis, a fragmentary epic of the epic cycle, Cassandra is seen clinging to the wooden statue of Athene, the Palladium during the sack, blood on her palms, curses in her mouth. Ajax the Lesser dragged her from the altar, violating sacred law. His punishment came not by spear, but by wave, when Poseidon, protector of oath and temple, drowned him beneath a rage-torn sea. This mythic retribution echoes deeper truths in Mycenaean maritime lore, where storms are seen as moral consequence and sacrilege calls downwind. Archaeological remains from Troy Via, specifically in the debris of the southern citadel, speak of violent collapse, beams charred, bodies twisted beneath slabs, arrowheads embedded in domestic walls. In this destruction, Cassandra's visions live. The fire was not only a metaphor, her journey did not end in Ilium. As the spoils of war were tallied, she was taken by Agamemnon, not with cruelty, but with imperial claim. She entered Mycenae not as a consort, but as an omen. The Lion Gate watched her pass beneath its limestone gaze, past the grave circles where kings lay with gold masks and bound knives, into a palace already pulsing with blood beneath its painted walls. There she walked like a goddess through mortal fate. In the frescoes of Mycenaean shrines, spiral-limbed priestesses standing between twin pillars, some scholars glimpse her echoes, a foreign queen who bore disaster like perfume. Even in silence, her presence sang of death. She foresaw the blade of Clytemnestra before it rose. She foresaw the cries of her own throat before they split the chamber. And still she walked forward. This act of walking, not fleeing, not pleading, is the heart of Cassandra's sanctity. Like the Delphic Sibyl who later inherits her archetype, she becomes the embodiment of divine utterance rejected by men. Her myth was not lost in the shifting sands of the empire. In Roman Asia Minor, votive tablets dedicated to Cassandra Fata, Cassandra of the Fates, suggest a local cult among women who dreamed too clearly. And in the oracular stones of Didyma, carved with faded lines of lament in Luwian script, there is a reference to the maiden whose mouth held the wind. Her legend, like her truth, refused to die. Cassandra is not the failure of prophecy, she is its martyr. She is the sacred wound of foresight, open and weeping across ages. Her curse was not silence, but the burden of being heard too late. And so her eyes remain, not closed, not forgotten. They look out from the night sea where drowned truths rise again as foam. They blink in the dreams of those who warn and are mocked. They watch the flame before it begins and do not flinch. She knew the war would come. She knew the home would fall. She knew her own blood would paint the stones of kings. And still she spoke. And still she walked. And still the gods remembered her. The twilight of the late Bronze Age, across the shattered palaces of the Aegean, birthed not only ruin, but women who bore the full weight of empires collapsed. Among them stands Hecuba, daughter of Dymas of Phrygia, wife of Priam, High Queen of Troy, not merely a woman, but a vessel of annihilation made flesh. Her name echoes through both Anatolian and Hellenic traditions, suspended between grief and metamorphosis, between historical memory and mythic curse. Her reign began in gold. In the courts of Wilusa, amid walls dated to Troy V before the fires, she walked in linen dyed with murex, heavy with necklaces of carnelian and electrum, stones pulled from the heart of distant rivers. Her voice echoed in the megaron beside her king, her sons, Hector, Paris, Deiphobus, trained in the spear arts while her daughters were given the rites of Ishtar and Artemis. The tablets of Hattusa refer obliquely to the queen's emissaries, suggesting her authority transcended the Troad. She was not ornament, she was sovereign. But kings fall, sons fall, cities fall. When the fire came, it did not begin with the Greek spears. It began with the gods who withdrew their favor. Athene, whose temple Hecuba is adorned with cloth offerings, turned her face. Apollo, whose lyre had sung over the plains, stood silent. Omens multiplied, dogs bore two heads, stars bled backwards, and the horses of the palace refused water. Cassandra screamed but was ignored. Hecuba watched. She buried her fears beneath ritual and incense. But the gods had already packed their silence into the stones. Then came the ships, black-prowed, death-ribbed. The Achaeans stormed the Dardanian shore, their bronze flashing with sky-reflected fire. Hector fell beneath Achilles' wrath. Paris was struck not by an arrow, but by the failure of prophecy. Priam was butchered on the altar of Zeus Hercules. One by one, her children were taken from her. Polyxena slaughtered at the tomb of Achilles. Polydorus murdered for gold. And Astyanax, her grandson, cast from the walls. In every surviving lament from the eastern Mediterranean, fragments of lamentation tablets from Imar, the dirges of Ogaret, the Akkadian city laments of Uruk, one figure recurs, the mother who buries her dynasty in ash and salt. Hecuba is their Hellenic incarnation. She was made a slave, not broken but bent like a tree that refuses to fall fully. Homer names her white-armed, even in grief, an epithet of ritual purity and ancestral divinity. Euripides in his Hecuba makes her speech tear the veil between woman and storm. In chains she cursed the gods, cursed Odysseus, cursed even the earth that bore her, and in her cursing she became something older than name. In Thrace, the tale changes. There it is said she avenged her son Polydorus, who had been murdered by King Polymestor. She lured the king, clawed his eyes out with her bare hands, and sang a curse that withered his line. Some say she turned into a hound, a wolf that haunts the shores of the Hellespont. Others say she walked into the sea and became a ghost whose voice rides the wind before war. Archaeologists in Thracian sites near Aenes and the lower Maritza have found grave of royal women buried not with offerings, but with broken spears and jars of ash, a funerary pattern anomalous for captured queens. The howling woman motif in local iconography, scratched into pottery in the 7th century BCE, bears a wolf-headed crown and weeps black tears. Inscriptions refer to her as Hecuba, the morning flame. It is Hecuba, disfigured by time, deified by pain. Her story did not end in servitude. It dissolved into water, into beast, into legend. For no queen who watches all she built burns can remain only a woman. She becomes omen. She becomes the mother of vengeance, the whisper in a daughter's nightmare, the breath that turns to frost in the lungs of generals. To speak her name now is to summon the silence after the empire, the scream behind every elegy. She was not merely queen of Troy. She was queen of its end. She is remembered not with temples, but with winds that strike the sea strangely, not with statues, but with curses muttered by widows, not with praise, but with the earth, clawed raw by nails that refused to forget. The war made ashes of her palace. She made myths from her ashes, and the gods, though silent, still listen when she speaks. The perpetuity of war across the ages cannot be disentangled from its oldest archetype, the siege of a city not merely of stone, but of spirit. The mythic memory of Troy, Wilusa in the Hittite tablets, Ilium in Homeric verse, did not close with flame. It opened a wound that generations returned to, as if compelled by divine repetition. From the plains of Kadesh to the fields of Normandy, war revisits the world wearing new names, but breathing the same smoke. Troy's fall, dated archaeologically to Troy Via, c. 1190 BCE, corresponds with the broader collapse of the Late Bronze Age, an era that saw Mycenae, Ugarit Hattusa, and other citadel powers vanish in fire and silence. The palatial systems built upon sacred kingship and trade routes extending from the Nile Delta to the Indus Valley dissolved like bones under siege. Yet the psychological blueprint of that fall, the betrayal, the broken vow, the wrath of the gods, echoed louder than any written record. The Assyrians who marched with iron chariots into Babylonian temples in the 8th century BCE claimed divine authority, just as Agamemnon had invoked the gods to justify his vengeance. In Sennacherib's inscriptions at Nineveh, we see siege engines and broken gates, captives flayed and cities burned, rituals not unlike the sack of Troy, though carried out in the name of Asher instead of Athene. The language shifts, but the choreography remains. War becomes theater, a sacred violence in which cities play the role of Troy again and again. By the time the Persians swept west under Darius and Xerxes, they too inherited the mirror. Their inscriptions, particularly at Behistun, mark rebellion, divine mandate, and the moral certainty of conquest. But at Marathon and Salamis, the Greek defense is framed in Homeric memory. Athenian hoplites, though armored in bronze and reason, still marched with Achilles, fury burning in their bones. Herodotus, in his histories, does not merely recount battles, he breathes myth into chronology. He knew, as all ancient chroniclers did, that history bends around Troy like the river Scamander bends around the plain. Archaeologically, this repetition manifests in the fortification patterns of post-Trojan cities. From the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae to the casemate designs in Israelite Lachish and Canaanite Hazor, civilizations rebuilt with memory. The ash layers are studied not only for carbon dating, but for signs of sacred refusal, deities erased, temples desecrated, statues decapitated. These are not just invasions, they are reenactments. Each attacker becomes another Achaean, each city another Ilion. Even in Rome, self-proclaimed heir of Troy through the legend of Aeneas, the war cycle persists. Virgil's Aeneid mourns the loss of Troy while justifying a new empire born in its ashes. The Romans, in turn, razed Carthage in 146 BCE, salting the earth and scripting speeches that echoed Homeric pride. In Gaul, in Britain, in Judea, they played out the siege again. Their columns and triumphal arches are not just monuments, they are stage props in an eternal act. And then came the Crusades. When Christian knights crossed into Anatolia and Syria in the 11th century CE, they carried crosses, but also epics. The Matter of France, the Song of Roland, and reimaginings of Hector and Achilles were copied in illuminated manuscripts. Even Richard the Lionheart, famed for his sword red of Troy. In the fortress of Acre, in the siege tunnels beneath Jerusalem, the war was told again, this time as holy war, but still a theft of the sacred, a fury born of women, gods, and fire. The ruins speak. Archaeological layers across Tel Brak, Alalak, Mycenae, and the burnt city of Troy itself, the same charcoaled patterns emerge, collapsed roof beams, arrowheads in rib bones, bowls unemptied. In Çatalhöyük, the skulls of ancestors were sometimes buried beneath the hearths, because memory must live under the fire, because we return again and again. The earth carries the sound of these stories long after the languages die. By the 20th century, as steel replaced bronze, the same script was followed. The Great War began not with Helen, but with Sarajevo. The faces changed, but the oaths did not. Treaties were broken, gods renamed as nations, and millions marched not for honor, but for vengeance and prophecy. The trenches of the Somme smelled of blood and burnt flesh, but also faintly of Ilium. The dust is the same wherever it falls. The pattern is not a myth, it is structured. In every war, the sacred is violated. Temples, women, altars, children. In every war there is a Hector who stands to defend what will fall. In every age there is a Cassandra who is not believed, a Hecuba who screams in chains. The gods have simply grown quiet, but their silence does not undo their presence. We think history moves forward, but in the sacred script of war it turns, like the wheel of a chariot circling Troy, like the rings of fire drawn in funeral ash, like the sea always returning to the shore. The Trojan War is not a story. It is a cycle, and it has not ended. It breathes beneath the concrete, it waits beneath the map, and when men forget, it remembers. The Gallipoli Peninsula, known in antiquity as the Thracian Chersonese, lies across the narrow waters from the ruined hill once called Troy. At its neck, the Dardanelles, the ancient Hellespont, funnels the Aegean Sea into the inland veins of Anatolia. And in the spring of 1915, the empires came again to its shores. Not with bronze-tipped spears and painted shields, but with rifles, barbed wire, and trench-dug resolve. Still, the ritual remained, young men spilling blood into sacred earth already heavy with memory. On April 25, 1915, Allied forces, chiefly British, French, Australian, and New Zealander, landed on these coasts in an operation destined to echo through myth and mourning alike. The Ottoman defense, commanded by Mustafa Kemal, carved its own epic in the cliffs and gullies. But beneath their boots and beneath their bones, 1,000 years of silent prophecy stirred. This was the plain of Ilium returned. The echo of Homer's wrath was now the thunder of machine guns. From the archaeological strata, unearthed in the 19th century by Schliemann and later excavated with scientific rigor by Wilhelm Dürpfeld, the layers of ancient Troy lay just across the water, Troy V and Troy Via bearing the blackened mark of siege and fire. Not far inland, the tumuli of Hellespontine Phrygia rose in silence, mounds like forgotten crowns of stone, some attributed to ancient kings, some merely to the wind. And now, in 1915, new mounds began to form, grave marked not by myth, but by bullet casings, wire, and the shallow breath of imperial exhaustion. The Anzacs, those from Australia and New Zealand, named their cove Anzac Cove, just as earlier warriors had named the Scamander and Simwa. In their letters, preserved in the brittle archives of war museums, they wrote of dust, of heat, of Turkish sharpshooters in the hills. But some wrote too of Troy, of standing on the same land Achilles once stormed, of rising before dawn and hearing seabirds cry like Cassandra's voice. They could not have known that the gods were still silent. Myth and memory do not vanish in mechanization. The rifles at Gallipoli may have outnumbered swords, but the dreams remained ancient. British officers, schooled in Homer, referred to the Ottoman resistance as the Trojans. Poetry filtered through telegrams. The blood of the English mingled with the blood of Ottomans, Armenians, Arabs, Kurds, and Greeks, just as Achaean blood had mixed with Phrygian. The soil of Gallipoli remembers everything. Trenches became grave. At Lone Pine and Chunuk Bair, men carved out their last prayers beneath roots. At Cape Helles, artillery pounded ridges once eroded by centuries of myth. And yet the earth bore it all with the same calm indifference it had offered to Paris and Helen, Hector and Patroclus. It did not cry out, it was only accepted. In the Gallipoli Peninsula Historical National Park today, rusted barbed wire still curls in the underbrush. Bones have been found even decades after the war, sometimes a femur, sometimes a skull with a bullet still inside. These, too, are offerings, though no altar stands. The war dead were buried hastily, and many remained where they fell. In time, the grave of the Allied and Ottoman soldiers were marked, some with marble, some with stone, some with the simplest iron crosses. But the true gravestone is the silence that settles at dusk. No ancient stele record this Iliad, but fragments of belt buckles, uniform buttons, and cartridge casings rest in the same dust as Mycenaean amphorae. The museums of Sanicail display both. Here, the millennia collapse. The same peninsula that saw the descent of Achaeans now holds the ghosts of Commonwealth soldiers. And if one listens near the water, where the waves lick the cliffs like tired lips, one can almost hear the chant of mourning women. Whether for Hector or for Harry, it is the same grief. Whether for Priam's sons or the sons of New South Wales, it is the same echo. Whether the fire came from burning palaces or from naval artillery, the sky turned red just the same. Mustafa Kemal, later called Ataturk, said of the Allied dead, "You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well." It is a statement carved in grief and myth, as if the very war had spoken, as if the battlefield itself had accepted the sacrifice, remembered the rhythm, and welcomed the blood. It is the kind of utterance Hecuba might have made if she had been given peace. The war at Gallipoli did not decide empires. The Ottoman Empire would fall regardless. The British Empire would bleed its century out in another war, and then another. But the sacred geography of war, its choreography, its ritual was rehearsed perfectly. The cliff stood. The sea swallowed the names. The bones whispered beneath the sand. And the cycle continued. Troy once more, but no wooden horse, only steel, and still no god spoke. The city of Troy, called Wilusa in Hittite tablets, Ilion in Homer's tongue, sleeps now beneath the Hissarlik mound of northwestern Anatolia, cloaked in wind-blown soil and millennia of unspoken prayers. 9 cities layered upon each other, one atop the next like ghosts pressing down on the earth. Beneath every stone a memory, beneath every silence a scream. Troy Via, the layer most scarred by fire and ruin, rests as though the fire had never left. Its walls, mud brick and limestone, cracked beneath the heat of siege, the betrayal of horse and shadow. And yet the city dreams still. Excavations by Schliemann, Dürpfeld and Blegen revealed not one Troy, but many. Troy II, with its polished treasure, was once mistaken for Priam's wealth. Troy V, with its towering fortifications, now thought to better fit Homer's age. Troy Via, with its hasty pottery and bodies in the streets, slain, unburied, laid down like broken prayers, whispers of a siege not sung but suffered. And though the palaces are gone and the fires have cooled, the city beneath the earth does not forget. At night, when the wind moves across the Dardanelles and the stars reflect in the Aegean like the eyes of gods, the city stirs, not in flesh or stone, but in the sacred current of ancestral dreams. For Troy, unlike other ruins, is not entirely past. It is a place that waits. Some say the horse creaks still, groaning with the weight of fate. That Helen's veil flutters in the silence between winds. That Hector walks the ramparts in armor blackened not by fire, but by memory. That Paris's arrow flies again in sleep, forever aimed at the unhealable. The city was not merely razed. It was buried with intention, layered beneath myths that could not die. The walls were not toppled to erase, but to preserve in silence, in sorrow, in stone. Beneath the layers, archaeologists found hearths still charred, ceramic vessels cracked where hands once blessed grain, walls painted with ochre, crumbling under the fingers of time. A child's femur was buried too shallow, bones bent, broken, sacred. These are not remnants, they are invocations. No inscription names the woman who watched her house burn from the citadel steps. No stele remembers the soldier who screamed for his mother beneath the tower's fall. No bard recited the names of the bakers, the smiths, the slaves, but the soil does, the worms do. The dust that rises with each tourist's step on the ancient stones carries the weight of prayers unanswered. In modern times, Troy is called Truva by the Turkish tongue, a UNESCO site. A museum of war turned silent, but even now offerings are made, flowers left on stone, whispered words in forgotten languages. Students write poetry at the site. Lovers photograph the horse replica that now stands sentinel near the entrance. Yet none of them know why their breath shortens as they walk the lower ramparts, why the air thickens with longing, because the city is not gone. It is only sleeping. It dreams through the dreams of others. Through Virgil's pen, where Aeneas carried his father through smoke and founded new empires. Through Dante's gates of hell, where Helen still weeps. Through Shakespeare's lines, where Achilles' wrath becomes man's mirror. Through wars fought for women, for honor, for empire, all named differently, but always the same song. The ancient rites, those to Apollo Thymbrius, to Athene of the walls, to Zeus of the high places, are no longer practiced. Their temples are shards in the museum's drawers. But when the moonlight strikes the ruins at certain angles, their altars seem to breathe again. Grass grows where priests once walked barefoot. Lizards sun themselves on thresholds that once trembled with prophecy. Some say Troy rises in dreams when the world grows too loud, that the gates open for those who remember not history but sorrow, that in the sleep between wars, the city calls to poets, to mothers, to those who have lost too much. And they walk her stones not as tourists, but as mourners, for Troy is not history's possession. She belongs to the ones who ache. She belongs to the child who cannot find his home in any book, to the woman who watches her sons go to war and knows how it ends, to the man who feels fire in his sleep and does not know why. She belongs to every soul who has stood in silence before ruins and felt the breath of something eternal, and in the dream she is whole again. Her towers rise against the morning, the sea is calm, the streets are swept, the horses are fed, Cassandra sings, Hector laughs with Andromache, Priam clasps his grandchildren, the horse has not come, the gates remain closed. But then the dream shifts, the creak of wood, the smell of pine, the flicker of flame, and you who stand at the edge of waking know what is coming. You walk the walls as you have always done, you smell ash before it burns, you see Helen in the tower. You see the sky breaking, and then you awaken, and the wind across Hisarlik whispers only stone. Troy sleeps again, but she remembers you.